Now imagine the hours slipping by. Midnight passes. The wind shrieks against shutters, but no one wakes. They are too tired, too buried beneath furs. First sleep fades and some stir, whisper prayers or sip possets, then drift back into second sleep. Dreams return, vivid and strange, carrying omens and stories that will be told in the morning. By dawn the fires are ash, the chambers colder than ever, but the night has been survived. That, in the medieval world, was victory enough. Here's a humorous aside. Picture the king waking in the dark, fumbling for his chamber pot, only to trip over a servant snoring at the foot of the bed. Both tumble into the rushes, the servant stammering apologies, the king grumbling that royalty deserves more space than this. Even monarchs, for all their power, could not escape the absurdities of communal sleeping. And here's another quirky note. Some castles ended nights with prayers led by chaplains moving chamber to chamber, sprinkling holy water and murmuring blessings. The rituals weren't just for piety, they were meant to ease minds into rest, to assure everyone that even if spirits roamed and drafts crept in, God's protection cloaked the castle as surely as the tapestries on the walls. Historians still debate how much of this nightly structure was genuine devotion versus simple habit. Did kings truly believe their dreams were messages from heaven, or did they just find comfort in saying so? Did queens sleep more soundly with relics under their pillows, or was it the extra fur blanket that did the trick? The ambiguity itself feels timeless. You stand now at the threshold of the chamber, looking back one last time. The royal bed looms large, curtains closed, a fortress within a fortress. Around it lie the tools of survival. The brazier, the shutters, the tapestries, the furs, the heated stones, each one a defence, each one imperfect, but together creating enough warmth to keep life going until spring. The silence deepens, and the castle feels like it too has lain down to sleep, its stones holding the memories of countless winters endured. And so you uncover the 20th and final secret of royal winter survival. At the end of every night, after all the rituals and tricks, what remained was endurance. Comfort was relative, warmth was fleeting, but survival was constant. The castle was not truly conquered, but endured, one breath at a time, one ember at a time, one sigh of sleep at a time. The scholars' debate fades into whispers behind you, and now the castle itself grows quieter. The fires are little more than faint glows in their hearths, braziers sink into ashes, and the rush-strewn floors creak only under the movement of servants making one last round before they collapse on their pallets. You wander back through corridors dimmed to near blackness, torches sputtering low, until you find yourself in the king's chamber once again. Here, the day finally ends. The castle, for all its grandeur and noise, descends into stillness. The king lies beneath his mountain of furs, his body heavy with wine and meat, his breath rattling softly in the canopy of curtains. The queen reclines in her own chamber, attended by her ladies until her eyes finally close. In the nursery, children lie bundled in swaddles, nurses half asleep but still watchful. The guards at the doors shift on their feet, stamping quietly to keep warm. All across the fortress, people surrender one by one to sleep that is never entirely restful, but always necessary. Mainstream history fact: despite the discomforts of castle winters, life found a rhythm. Servants, nobles, guards, and royals all participated in nightly routines designed to maximize survival. The repetition of rituals, closing shutters, drawing curtains, warming stones, layering clothes, created a sense of order against the chaos of nature outside. Survival was never a single act, but a chain of actions, repeated tirelessly each evening. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some castles kept night watch bells, rung at intervals to mark time and assure everyone that the guards were still awake. Imagine lying in bed half asleep, only to hear the low clang of a bell echo through stone halls, a strange comfort reminding you that someone, somewhere, was still fighting off sleep so you could rest. Historians still argue whether these nightly outings brought true peace, or whether they only disguised constant discomfort. Some claim royals slept soundly after their feasts, warmed by furs and stones. Others insist sleep was restless, broken by draughts, smoke, and fear of spirits. The debate, like the wind outside, will never fully cease. You lean against the wall and absorb the chamber's silence. The fire is almost gone, its glow a faint heartbeat in the grate. The brazier beside the bed has cooled, its coals reduced to a red blush. Curtains trap what little warmth remains, their folds glowing faintly in the candle's last flicker. The king sighs in his sleep, rolling against the weight of his robes. The queen, in her chamber, clutches her rosary even as her breath steadies. The servants, sprawled on straw nearby, twitch in their dreams, their duty lingering even in sleep. The sensory weight of the castle at night is immense. You hear the faint drip of melting frost from the ceiling, the soft whimper of a child in the nursery, the shuffle of boots as a guard trades shifts. You smell smoke, cold stone, damp wool, and the faint sweetness of herbs burned to keep nightmares away. You feel the heaviness of the air, cold but quieter, softened by exhaustion. But beyond the humour lies a serious question. What does it mean to be comfortable? For a medieval monarch, comfort was relative. Compared to peasants in drafty huts, the king's chamber was luxury itself. Feather beds, fur blankets, braziers glowing, servants tending. But compared to our modern world, even the most lavish chamber would feel like an icebox. Comfort then was less about perfection than about hierarchy. To be warmer than others was to be privileged, even if you still shivered. Historians still debate whether castles were ever intended to be permanent homes at all. Some argue they were military outposts first, residences second. Others emphasize the gradual transformation. Over centuries, castles became more refined, with larger windows, more fireplaces, and eventually entire wings devoted to comfort. Yet in the high medieval period, survival often outweighed coziness. You imagine the debate continuing into the night. One scholar argues that the symbolism of castles outweighed any discomfort. To see stone rising against the sky, he says, to know your enemies cannot breach it, this is worth 1,000 frozen toes. Another counters that symbolism won't help you sleep through a January night without coughing yourself awake. The candles flicker, tempers flare, and you realize that this argument is eternal. Function versus comfort, defense versus dwelling, survival versus luxury. The sensory weight of the debate deepens. You hear voices echoing off stone, amplified by the cold emptiness of the chamber. You see frost clinging to the ink pots, making the quills stiff in hand. You feel the scholars stamping their feet, warming themselves as they argue about warmth. Even their debate is lived, embodied, fought against the very chill they analyse. Here's another quirky note. Some chroniclers described castles as more suitable for owls than men, complaining about draughts, darkness and dampness. Others wrote poems praising their grandeur, describing them as palaces of the north. The contradiction captures the heart of the debate, beauty and misery entwined in stone. And here's another touch of humour. Imagine one scholar trying to prove his point, wrapping himself in a tapestry to demonstrate how effective they are against draughts. He struts about, half hidden in embroidered saints, while the others jeer that he looks like a holy sausage. Even intellectuals couldn't resist turning survival tactics into comedy. The truth, you realise, is that both sides are right. Castles were survivable, but only through immense labour and ritual. They were symbols of wealth, but also monuments of discomfort. They offered protection against enemies, but rarely against frost. Comfort existed in layers, layers of furs, of servants, of rituals, and even then it was fragile, temporary, always threatened by the cold pressing outside. Historians still argue whether this fragility made castles more impressive or more tragic. Were they triumphs of human resilience, proof that people could endure even the harshest conditions? Or were they failures of design, monuments to pride that forgot the needs of the body? The debate will likely never end because castles themselves resist simple definitions. As you leave the scholars to their parchments and quills, you feel the weight of their words. They are not just debating architecture, they are debating survival, identity, and meaning. Their arguments echo the experience of every guard, servant, queen, and king who ever lay awake in a draughty chamber, wondering whether the castle was protecting them or punishing them. And so you uncover the 19th secret of royal winter survival. Even among the learned, comfort was contested. Castles were symbols, fortresses, homes, prisons, all at once. To live in them was to live in contradiction, to endure both grandeur and hardship, to survive in spaces designed as much for fear as for warmth. The nursery's laughter fades into the night, and now you find yourself wandering toward a quieter corner of the castle, a space not filled with firelight or children's giggles, but with parchment, ink, and debate. Imagine a long wooden table scattered with scrolls and manuscripts, candles guttering low in their holders, wax dripping onto the boards. Around it sit scholars, chroniclers, and advisors, their cloaks pulled tight as they argue in hushed tones. Tonight, the topic is not policy or war, it is the very question of comfort itself. Were these castles truly livable during the frozen months, or were they simply symbols of power where even kings shivered in their beds? You take a seat at the edge of the gathering, leaning close to catch their words. One scholar insists that castles were marvels of engineering, designed not only for defense but also for habitation. He points to the tapestries, the braziers, the thick furs, the canopied beds, all evidence, he claims, that life was manageable, even pleasant. Our forebears were hardy, he says, tapping his parchment. They built not only fortresses but homes. These walls protected both body and spirit. Another scholar scoffs, wrapping his russet cloak tighter around his shoulders. Homes, he echoes. Do you not feel the draft on your neck even now? Do you not hear the wind rattling the shutters? These were not homes. They were prisons of stone, cold and damp, monuments to fear rather than comfort. The king survives not because the castle is warm, but because he commands an army of servants to fight the cold for him. Mainstream history fact: historians even today continue this debate. Some argue that medieval castles, with their tapestries, fireplaces, and architectural innovations, were reasonably comfortable for their time. Others emphasize the accounts of draughty halls, smoky fires, and constant cold, portraying castles as functional fortresses rather than cozy dwellings. The reality was likely a blend of both perspectives. Comfort achieved only through relentless effort, never taken for granted. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some chronicles, foreign visitors mocked northern castles, calling them stone barns or dens of frost. One Italian traveller complained that English castles were so damp and frigid he preferred to sleep wrapped in his cloak in a stable rather than in a lord's guest chamber. Imagine that insult: all the tapestries, all the wealth, all the ceremony, and your guest chooses the company of horses instead. Historians still argue about how much these complaints were exaggerated. Were they genuine reflections of unbearable cold, or were they coloured by cultural bias, southerners shocked by northern climates? The debate has never been resolved, leaving modern scholars to sift through anecdotes, architectural remains, and guesswork. The sensory details of this scholarly quarrel fill your mind. You hear the scratch of quills against parchment as arguments are recorded. You smell ink mixed with smoke from candles that drip steadily onto the table. You feel the tension in the air as voices rise, words sharp, each man convinced his view will outlast the others. Around them the castle creaks and groans as if joining the debate, its very stones offering testimony. Now, picture a king overhearing such a conversation. Would he laugh at the idea that his castle was unlivable? Or would he secretly agree, shivering under his furs? Perhaps he'd lean closer to the fire, muttering that comfort was not the point. Castles existed to project power, to resist siege, to dominate landscapes. If they were cold, so be it. Survival, not softness, was their essence. Here's a humorous aside. Imagine one scholar, eager to prove castles livable, boasting that he never feels the cold. At 2. Hat. Exact moment. His candle goes out, and he sneezes so loudly the others burst into laughter. Even in debate, the castle itself seems to have the last word. Historians still debate whether the survival of royal children was higher than that of commoners. Some evidence suggests yes, better food, better care, more protection. But other records reveal that disease and cold struck royal nurseries just as cruelly as village huts. Wealth could not always buy health. The cold, after all, respected no titles. So as you sit in the nursery, surrounded by laughter, prayers, and the faint warmth of braziers, you uncover the 18th secret of royal winter survival. The fight for warmth wasn't only for kings and queens, but for their heirs. In these small chambers under woolen blankets and beside glowing stones, the next generation of monarchs battled the same drafts and fears. Their survival was the truest victory, the quiet triumph that ensured castles remained filled with life despite the winter pressing outside. Now picture the nightly rituals. Before bed, children were washed. If water was warm enough, then rubbed with oils to keep skin from cracking in the cold. They were swaddled or dressed in woolen gowns, caps pulled tight over heads, mittens tied around tiny wrists. Nurses checked shutters, adjusted tapestries, and set charms by the beds. Crosses, amulets, sprigs of herbs. Lullabies mixed prayer with superstition, words meant to comfort both child and caretaker. Sleep was not just rest, it was a ritual of protection. Here's a humorous aside. Imagine a young prince refusing to wear his woolen cap, throwing it across the room in defiance. The nurse chases him, muttering about frostbitten ears, while the boy giggles and hides under the dog. Even in the severity of medieval winters, children found ways to turn survival into play. But the nursery was not only domestic, it was political. Each child represented the future of the dynasty, the continuation of power. Their survival through winter was more than personal, it was national. Every warmed stone, every extra blanket, every prayer whispered at midnight was not only for comfort but for the preservation of lineage. A sick child could mean instability, a dead heir could plunge kingdoms into crisis. The nursery carried the weight of empires, tucked beneath wool and fur. Historians still debate how deeply parents were involved in these nightly rituals. Some kings and queens visited their children often, showing affection in private moments. Others remained distant, leaving care entirely to nurses and attendants. Letters and chronicles record both tender encounters and chilling indifference. What remains certain is that the nursery staff bore the burden of keeping royal children alive through winters that claimed so many young lives across Europe. You imagine the Queen visiting briefly before sleep. She enters quietly, cloak, against the cold, and kisses the forehead of her youngest child. The nurses bow, holding candles to light her way. She lingers only a few minutes, whispering blessings, then retreats to her chamber, leaving her children in the hands of women she must trust completely. The warmth of motherhood collides with the cold reality of monarchy. Even in love, distance was required. The sensory experience lingers. You feel the heat of a brazier radiating against your legs as you sit in the nursery. You hear a child whimper, then calm as a nurse adjusts the blanket. You see frost forming on the shuttered window, but inside, the glow of firelight softens every face. For a moment, the harshness of the castle seems lessened, transformed by laughter and lullabies into something almost gentle. Here's another quirky note. Some nurseries included dream books or manuals where nurses recorded children's dreams as omens of future character. If a child dreamed of animals, it might mean bravery. If they dreamed of falling, it might mean danger ahead. Imagine a nurse carefully jotting down that the prince dreamed of wolves, whispering that it might foretell a warrior's destiny or a kingdom's downfall. The humour of childhood persists, though. Imagine two royal toddlers kicking off their blankets in the middle of the night, their nurses rushing to cover them again, only for the cycle to repeat until dawn. Even princes and princesses, for all their symbolic weight, resisted the routines of warmth with the stubbornness of children everywhere. And yet, the truth of the nursery remains stark. Winter survival here was fragile. Every cough, every chill, every draught carried the threat of loss. Attendants lived with constant vigilance, knowing that the future of kingdoms lay in the fragile bodies they swaddled nightly. Their success was measured not in comfort, but in survival rates, in childres, and waking each morning with flushed cheeks instead of pale lips. The Queen's chamber settles into silence, her ladies breathing softly around her bed, but beyond those walls another sound stirs, the faint laughter of children. You follow it down a narrow passage into a smaller chamber where the royal nursery resides. Here, princes and princesses learn the realities of castle winters long before they learn the weight of crowns. It is a place of warmth and noise, both comfort and hardship, a tiny world where childhood pushes against the cold stones of responsibility. Picture the nursery now. The walls are narrower, the ceiling lower than in the grand chambers of the king and queen. Tapestries of brighter colours, greens, teals and saffrons, hang on the walls, stitched with animals or saints meant to amuse and protect. A brazier glows in the corner, tended constantly by nurses. Small wooden cradles and low beds line the room, covered with woolen blankets and miniature fur throws. The air smells faintly of milk, smoke and beeswax, an earthy mixture of life and survival. Mainstream history fact: royal children rarely slept alone. Nurseries were staffed by nurses, governesses and attendants who lived constantly at their side. These caretakers not only provided warmth and food, but also ensured that the children of monarchs were never unprotected, even in the vulnerability of sleep. Infant princes were swaddled tightly in wool, their bodies wrapped to conserve heat, while older children shared beds with siblings or attendants to survive the drafts. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some royal nurseries used warming dolls, cloth figures filled with heated stones or herbs, to place beside children in their beds. The idea was both to keep the child warm and to comfort them with the feeling of another body nearby. Imagine a little princess drifting off with a lavender-scented doll glowing faintly from the warmth of stones hidden within, unaware thus that her survival depended on such creative tricks. Historians still argue whether royal nurseries were genuinely comfortable or simply less miserable than other chambers. Some describe them as cheerful spaces lined with toys, brightly dyed fabrics, and constant warmth. Others emphasize the risks: smoky fires choking the air, braziers tipping dangerously close to wooden cradles, infants succumbing to cold despite every effort. The truth likely swung between these extremes, depending on season, staff, and the attentiveness of those in charge. You crouch by one cradle, peering at the small figure swaddled tightly within. The baby's breath rises in tiny puffs of steam, the face red with warmth beneath layers of cloth. A nurse rocks the cradle gently, humming a lullaby in a language older than the castle walls. The sound blends with the crackle of coals, softening the chamber into a cocoon of rhythm and heat. Nearby, a toddler giggles as he tugs at the ear of a hound curled loyally beside the bed. The dog shifts but does not move away. Its warmth is as much a blanket as any fur. The sensory details surround you. The nursery hums with life in contrast to the silence of the Queen's chamber. You hear the squeak of wooden cradles, the patter of small feet on straw, the constant murmurs of attendants soothing, scolding, or laughing. You smell milk spilled on linen, herbs burned in braziers, wet wool drying near the fire. You see children's faces flushed with warmth, hair sticking damp to their foreheads from heavy blankets. Every detail reminds you, survival here was communal, noisy, and tender. So, as you linger in the Queen's chamber, watching the curtains draw tighter, you uncover the 17th secret of royal winter survival. Separation was another form of strength. Kings and queens did not always share a bed, but by maintaining distinct sanctuaries, they created two hearths against the cold, two centres of ritual and authority. In a castle where warmth was fleeting and privacy rare, the Queen's chamber stood as her fortress, part domestic, part political, entirely essential. Here's a humorous aside. Imagine the king deciding to surprise the Queen with a late-night visit, only to find her already surrounded by three ladies-in-waiting gossiping about a spilled goblet at dinner. He sighs, mutters something about no peace even here, and retreats back through the door, leaving the women giggling behind their hands. But beneath the humour lies a deeper truth. Separate chambers reflected the balance of power. The Queen wasn't just a wife, she was a ruler in her own right, with her own household, her own attendants, her own routines. Her chamber symbolised that autonomy, even as it existed within the broader structure of the king's authority. To step into her space was to acknowledge her role, not just as companion, but as sovereign partner. Historians still debate how much agency queens truly had in these private spaces. Some argue they wielded significant influence, shaping policy through counsel given in bedchambers. Others contend their role was more ceremonial, confined to domestic and dynastic duties. Both views contain truth, and the Queen's separate chamber was the arena where these roles overlapped. The rituals of warmth were the same here as in the king's room: furs, braziers, shutters, stones, but the atmosphere shifted. Where the king's chamber echoed with the weight of authority, the Queen's glowed with intimacy. She might host her children briefly before sleep, gathering them onto her bed to tell stories, their small bodies wriggling under furs. She might share laughter with her ladies, joking about the absurdities of court life, or she might kneel in prayer, her breath frosting in the candlelight, whispering for protection over her family. Here's another quirky note. In some courts, the Queen's chamber was considered a space of refuge. Nobles might slip in to plead for mercy or protection, knowing the Queen's influence could soft. And the king's wrath. Imagine a desperate courtier kneeling at her bed, begging through tears, while the Queen, wrapped in wool and half asleep, murmurs that she'll speak to His Majesty in the morning. Even in her nightclothes, her political role never truly ceased. The sensory details continue to build. You hear a child's laughter echo faintly from the adjoining nursery. You smell the sharp tang of rosemary burned in the brazier to cleanse the air. You feel the heavy quiet after the Queen finally drifts into slumber, her ladies settling around her like satellites, the room dimming into a rhythm of breathing and crackling coals. Humour returns as you picture a hound sneaking into the chamber, curling up at the foot of the Queen's bed despite protests. The dog snores louder than any servant, and in the morning the Queen sighs but lets it stay. Even royalty surrendered occasionally to the warmth of companionship, however furry. And yet, beneath the softness, the symbolism lingers. Separate chambers weren't about distance alone, they were about identity. Kings and queens lived parallel lives, intersecting as duty or affection required, but always retaining their own domains. In winter, this separation became even more practical. 2 chambers meant 2 fires, 2 sets of braziers, 2 groups of servants maintaining warmth. Power, like comfort, was doubled, distributed across walls. Historians still argue whether this arrangement weakened bonds or preserved them. Did sleeping apart breed coldness between royal couples, or did it allow space that made marriages last? The answer, of course, depends on the individuals. For some, distance was relief. For others, it was loneliness masked by protocol. The queen stirs in her bed, restless after a night of uneasy dreams. Her sigh drifts through the curtains, and suddenly you notice something important. The bed she lies in isn't the king's. It stands in its own chamber, separated by walls and ritual. This is the queen's chamber, her private space, distinct from the king's domain. In many castles, kings and queens did not sleep side by side every night. Distance, as much as closeness, defined royal beds. Picture the queen's chamber now. It is smaller than the king's solar, but still richly adorned. Tapestries hang heavy on the walls, woven with saints or scenes from romances. A smaller fireplace smoulders with embers, tended by ladies-in-waiting. The bed is draped in saffron-coloured curtains embroidered with gold thread, less ostentatious than the king's crimson canopy, but no less protective against draughts. A polished chest sits at the foot of the bed, holding linens and furs. Candles gutter softly in iron sconces, their flames trembling whenever a draught sneaks under the door. Mainstream history. Fact. It was common in medieval Europe for kings and queens to sleep separately, each with their own chambers and households of attendants. Shared beds did occur, especially for intimacy, childbearing, or symbolic unity, but privacy, protocol, and practicality often kept them apart. Queens needed their own spaces for audiences, prayer, and control over their personal attendants. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some queens used their chambers as miniature courts, conducting business from bed in the mornings. Ladies-in-waiting, clerks, and even messengers might gather around as the queen dictated letters or made decisions, still wrapped in furs and nightgown. Imagine her issuing royal commands with hair tucked under a teal nightcap, yawning between decrees. It sounds almost comic, yet it was a true blending of domestic and political life. Historians still argue whether separate chambers symbolized emotional distance or simply practical necessity. Did kings and queens grow apart because of this arrangement, or was it understood as normal, even healthy? Some chronicles hint at affection expressed in nightly visits, while others describe marriages that seemed more like political alliances than partnerships. The debate continues, shadowed by the fact that each royal couple was unique. You watch as the Queen's ladies move about quietly. One adjusts the curtains, tucking them tight to block a draught. Another lays a warmed stone at the foot of the bed. A third smooths the rushes on the floor, muttering about fleas. The Queen herself pulls her cloak tighter, glancing toward the door that connects to the King's chamber. Will he visit tonight or not? Sometimes the decision was personal. Sometimes it was ceremonial, dictated by politics and dynastic needs. The sensory experience of the chamber is intimate. You hear the muffled shuffle of slippers on straw. You smell beeswax candles mixing with lavender sachets tucked into the bed linens. You see firelight ripple across the golden thread of the bed curtains, turning them into a soft, glowing wall. You feel the stillness, a quieter energy than the King's chamber, less military, more domestic, though no less bound by ritual. Now picture the contrast. In the King's chamber, guards stand at the door, pages whisper at the hearth, and the air is tense with politics. In the Queen's chamber, the mood is softer. Women murmur prayers, comb hair, fold clothing, share gossip. Yet even here, privacy is never absolute. Servants still sleep nearby, eyes half open in case the Queen calls. The sense of solitude is more illusion than reality. So as you lie back beneath the heavy furs, listening to the wind and the whispers of servants, you uncover the 16th secret of royal winter survival. It wasn't just about warming the body, it was about guarding the soul. Sleep was never only rest, it was a ritual of defense against cold and against darkness, a nightly negotiation with spirits as much as with frost. And in this way, kings and queens discovered that survival was not only measured in fires and furs, but in prayers whispered at midnight, in charms sewn into hems, in the fragile hope that dreams would bring comfort instead of terror. Here's a humorous aside. Imagine the king dreaming that a goose chased him through the great hall, only to wake shouting, "The goose must be an omen of war." His courtiers nod solemnly, trying not to laugh, while one mutters, "Majesty, perhaps it was just the roast goose from supper." Even in superstition, comedy found its way in. But behind the humour lies fear. The night wasn't just cold, it was vulnerable. With senses dulled by sleep, the soul was thought to wander, exposed to spirits. Some believed demons could press upon the chest, causing nightmares and a sensation of suffocation, what we now call sleep paralysis. Royals weren't immune to this. Imagine the king thrashing in his bed, convinced a black figure sat on his chest, stealing his breath. In the morning, such visions might become stories of demonic attack, whispered with dread in the corridors. Historians still debate whether superstition dominated royal sleep or whether these fears were more common among peasants. Records suggest both. Kings consulted priests for dream interpretations, while peasants whispered of witches and spirits. In truth, all levels of society feared the vulnerability of night. For royals, those fears carried extra weight because their dreams could be used by others to sway politics. Now imagine the remedies. To guard against nightmares, priests blessed chambers, sprinkling holy water in corners. Herbs like lavender, sage, or juniper were burned to purify air. Some nobles slept with relics, tiny bones of saints, holy crosses, placed beneath pillows for protection. Even the act of drawing heavy bed curtains was symbolic, not only to trap warmth, but to keep spirits out. Each ritual layered protection upon protection against both frost and phantoms. Here's another quirky note. Medieval people often divided sleep into two shifts, first sleep and second sleep. They would wake in the yaus, middle of the night, pray, reflect on dreams, or even talk quietly with servants, then drift back into slumber. Imagine the queen rising after her first sleep, sipping a warm posset, whispering about a troubling dream to her ladies, then lying back down for her second round of rest. Dreams weren't confined to silence. They became part of conversation, woven into the rhythm of the night. The sensory texture of these midnight interludes is striking. The fire crackles faintly, shadows stretch across tapestries, and the smell of extinguished candles lingers. Whispered voices fill the stillness, servants murmuring prayers, the queen sighing as she pulls her furs closer. Night is broken into fragments, each carrying its own rituals, each haunted by the possibility of visions. Humor finds a place even here. Picture a servant falling asleep on watch, snoring loudly enough to wake the king. Startled, the monarch mutters that the sound was a demon, only to discover it's just his page curled against a straw pallet. The laughter that follows dispels the fear, proving that even superstition could be lightened by shared humanity. And yet, the deeper truth remains. Sleep was never entirely safe in the medieval world. Not only did cold threaten the body, but the imagination itself became vulnerable. Dreams carried weight, nightmares carried fear. The unseen world pressed against the curtains, demanding acknowledgement. Historians still argue whether royals truly believed their dreams or whether they used them politically, shaping narratives to justify choices. Did the king march to war because he saw victory in a dream, or because he already planned it and used the dream as divine confirmation? The line between belief and strategy is blurred, as it so often was in medieval life. The echoes of laughter and clinking goblets fade as the castle slowly quiets, but your mind drifts to another layer of the night. Not physical warmth, not furs, not fire, but the strange world of dreams and the superstitions that shaped them. In the stillness of a medieval bedchamber, when the fire dwindled to embers and the last servant yawned, royals often confronted more than just the cold. They confronted the mysteries of sleep itself with its spirits, omens, and visions. Picture the king now lying beneath his crimson canopy, eyes heavy from mulled wine. His feet press against the faint heat of a cooling stone, but his mind is restless. He whispers a prayer, crossing himself because he knows what comes when sleep takes him. Dreams, sometimes sweet, sometimes terrifying. For in the medieval world, dreams weren't just the mind's ramblings, they were messages. They could come from God, from demons, from wandering spirits. A nightmare could shake a kingdom's confidence. A pleasant dream could be interpreted as divine approval. Mainstream history fact: medieval people took dreams very seriously. From biblical references to medieval dream manuals, sleep visions were often seen as prophecy, warning, or divine instruction. Monks wrote treatises on the meaning of dreams, while kings and queens consulted priests to interpret troubling visions. Dreams weren't private matters. They could influence decisions in war, politics, and marriage. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some people slept with small charms or amulets sewn into their clothes or tucked beneath pillows to ward off nightmares. These might be simple herbs like lavender or protective symbols embroidered into fabric. Imagine the queen adjusting her nightcap, knowing a sprig of rosemary is stitched into the seam, convinced it will keep demons from whispering in her sleep. Historians still argue whether dreams truly aped royal decisions or whether chroniclers exaggerated their importance. Some records describe kings waking in terror and changing plans based on dreams. Others dismiss these stories as retroactive justifications, written to make choices seem divinely guided. The truth probably lies somewhere between. Dreams may not have dictated every action, but they added weight to fears and ambitions already simmering. You close your eyes and try to imagine the royal dreamscape. The fire is low, the curtains are drawn, the bed is a cocoon of furs, and yet the mind roams free. The king might dream of riding through forests, hunting stags, the very image embroidered on his wall tapestries. Or he might see darker visions, enemies at the gates, his crown tumbling into snow, his own breath frosting into silence. Each dream carries meaning. Each one demands interpretation. The sensory details are ghostly. You hear the sigh of wind outside, and in the half-sleep of the medieval imagination, that sigh becomes a voice. You smell the smoke of the brazier, and in dreams it becomes fire consuming the castle. The mind takes every detail of the chamber and reshapes it into a vision. For royals, whose choices carried the weight of nations, such visions could never be ignored. Picture the queen waking suddenly, clutching at her chest, insisting she saw shadows crawling through her bed curtains. Her ladies rush to her side, lighting candles, whispering prayers. They murmur about spirits, perhaps the souls of the restless dead, perhaps demons seeking entry. A priest might be summoned at dawn to bless the chamber, sprinkle holy water, and declare the queen safe. For in the medieval worldview, the night was not neutral. It was a battlefield between light and dark, and dreams were the weapons. But food wasn't only comfort, it was also symbolic. Serving roasted boar or venison demonstrated wealth and power. Displaying exotic spices proved connections across trade routes. To eat well was to declare supremacy, even over nature. The storm outside may rage, the feast declared, but here we eat oranges from Spain and pepper from India. Survival was flavoured with spectacle. Historians still debate whether the heavy medieval diet led to more sickness than health. Obesity, gout, and indigestion were common among the nobility, yet the high-calorie intake also provided insulation during cold winters. Was the price worth it? Some argue yes, better to risk gout at 50 than freeze at 20. Others disagree, pointing out the toll these diets took on longevity. Now imagine the Queen's personal routine. After a hearty supper, she retreats with her ladies-in-waiting to a smaller chamber where they sip warm possets, a drink of milk curdled with ale or wine sweetened with spices. It's thick, almost pudding-like, and said to induce sleep. They murmur gossip, share laughter, and then finally rise, cheeks warm, ready to crawl into fur-lined beds. Food, drink, and laughter together form a shield, as vital as shutters or braziers. Here's another quirky note. Some nobles believed drinking mulled wine before bed would not only keep them warm, but also guard against nightmares. The heat of the drink was thought to balance the cold humours that caused troubling dreams. Imagine the king sipping one last goblet, muttering that it would chase away demons, before collapsing into snores that rattled the curtains. The sensory detail of such a night lingers. You can almost hear the soft belch of a courtier dozing against the table. You can smell cinnamon clinging to the air, mingling with the heavier odour of roasting fat. You can see the golden reflection of torches in spilled wine, puddled across wooden tables. Even as the fires dim, the memory of abundance remains. Yet beneath the humour and spectacle, there's truth. These meals weren't just about excess. They were about survival, about creating a furnace inside the body that made the next few hours in a freezing chamber possible. The royals, swaddled in wool and fur, slept not only on heated stones but also on the warmth of digestion itself. Historians still argue whether food or fire was more important in winter survival. Some point to the constant labour of servants hauling wood as proof that fire was central. Others highlight the enormous quantities of food consumed as equally critical. Likely, both were essential, two sides of the same coin, external heat from flames, internal heat from feasts. So as the last goblet is drained and the hall falls silent, you uncover the 15th secret of royal winter survival. Warmth was eaten and drunk. The body itself became a hearth, stoked with meat, bread, and spice, glowing faintly as digestion worked through the night. To feast was to fight the cold from within, a nightly ritual that blurred the line between indulgence and necessity. And as you rise from the table, belly heavy, eyes drooping, you realize sleep might still be draughty, but hunger will not follow you into the cold chambers. In this way, royals discovered a truth that even peasants shared. Food is fire you carry inside. The storm outside howls on, but now the scene shifts to a much warmer corner of castle life, the feasting table. Before royals even thought about sleep, they often fortified themselves with heavy meals and spiced drinks. You step into the great hall again, only now it's alive with noise and fragrance. The fire roars, torches flare, and tables groan beneath roasted meats, wheels of cheese, trenchers of bread, and goblets brimming with mulled wine. In a castle where draughts made every chamber feel like a crypt, food itself was another defense against winter. Imagine the king sitting at the high table, a crown glinting faintly in the firelight, while servants carry in platters of venison dripping with fat. The queen raises a goblet, inhaling the steam of hot wine infused with cinnamon and cloves, its scent cutting through the smoke. Children gnaw on roasted apples, their cheeks flushed from both firelight and drink. Even the courtiers lower down the hall feast heartily, boar ribs, pheasant pies, loaves of dense rye bread. Tonight the castle doesn't feel so frigid. Tonight warmth is swallowed, not just gathered. Mainstream history fact: medieval diets were high in calories, especially during winter. Nobles consumed large quantities of meat, cheese, bread, and ale, believing that hearty meals fortified the body against cold. Mulled wine and spiced ales were particularly prized, both for their flavour and their supposed medicinal properties. A full stomach, after all, burns heat through digestion, a primitive but effective way of staving off chill. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some feasts included dishes specifically believed to warm the humours. Spiced hippocras, a sweetened wine, ginger pastries, and peppered stews weren't just luxuries, they were thought to rebalance the body's elements, making people literally warmer. Imagine a noble biting into a ginger cake and confidently declaring, "This will keep me from freezing to death tonight." Science? Not really. Placebo? Absolutely. Historians still argue how much these feasts genuinely helped with warmth versus how much they simply provided comfort. Some say the sheer calorie intake, thousands per day for the elite, did provide real insulation against winter's bite. Others argue the psychological effect was stronger. Eating and drinking until drowsy created the illusion of warmth, lulling royals into sleep they might otherwise resist. Either way, feasts were nightly rituals of survival, not just indulgence. The sensory world here is overwhelming. You hear the crack of roasting meat on spits, the pop of dripping fat hissing into flames. You smell cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, rare spices carried overseas, worth their weight in gold. You feel the warmth of wine sliding down your throat, spreading through your chest like a private fire. You see faces flushed, hands greasy, goblets raised in cheer. Every sense conspires to convince you that winter cannot touch this hall tonight. Picture the aftermath. Stomachs heavy, limbs sluggish, laughter mellowing into yawns. Courtiers stagger from the benches, some choosing to collapse near the hearth rather than face the icy trek to their chambers. The king himself stretches, stifling a yawn, and calls for more mulled wine to keep the chill away. By the time he finally retires, his belly is lined with roasted meats and his veins hum with spiced drink. Sleep may still be cold, but at least it will not be hungry. Here's a humorous scene. A nobleman drinks too much hippocras and tries to stand, only to tip backward into a platter of roasted goose. The hall erupts in laughter. The king chuckles and the poor servant tasked with cleaning sighs deeply. Even amid the grandeur, slapstick moments like this were inevitable, adding warmth of a different kind. And so, as snow hammers the shutters and frost paints lace on the tapestries, you realize royalty in these regions didn't sleep soundly because their castles were warm. They slept because exhaustion overcame discomfort, because rituals dulled the edge of fear, and because the alternative, facing the storm outside, was worse. Here's a humorous image. A royal courtier sneezes so hard his breath freezes mid-air, leaving a tiny icicle dangling from his moustache. The others laugh, though quietly, because they know they'll look just as ridiculous in a few minutes. Humour was another layer of insulation. Jokes about frozen ink in quills, jokes about noble noses turning blue. And yet, despite the hardship, castles in these regions were adapted in clever ways. Some built deeper fireplaces designed to trap more heat. Others used wooden paneling on walls, creating an extra barrier against the cold. Floors might be covered not only with rushes, but with thick wooden planks raised above stone, creating a buffer from the frozen ground. Still, these were partial solutions, never complete victories. Historians still debate how much life retreated during the coldest months. Did kings continue holding courts, banquets, and councils, or did they scale back, conserving energy and fuel? Evidence suggests both. Some records describe winter feasts continuing despite snow piling at the gates. Others mention monarchs withdrawing, their activities limited to the bare essentials. In every case, survival dictated routine. Now step into a Scandinavian stronghold perched on a cliff above icy seas. The wind lashes salt spray against stone walls, coating everything in a thin crust of ice. Inside, servants scurry with armloads of wood, trying to keep fires alive. Nobles retreat into inner chambers, their voices muffled by heavy hangings. Even here, amidst wealth and ritual, the fight against winter never ends. The sensory overwhelm is intense. You feel frost sting your cheeks, even indoors. You hear constant creaking as timbers groan under the weight of snow. You smell wet wool drying by the fire, a heavy, earthy scent. And beneath it all, you taste the metallic tang of cold air that never quite leaves your lungs. Is another quirky note. In some northern castles, animals were occasionally stabled inside lower levels during the coldest nights, their body heat rising to warm the floors above. Imagine falling asleep in your chamber while the muffled sounds of cattle shift below, their warmth seeping upward into your mattress. Practical, yes, though hardly romantic. And here's another moment of humour. Imagine a visiting courtier from warmer France, bundled in every garment he owns, complaining loudly that your castles are colder than the grave. The locals shrug, sip their mulled ale and chuckle, because for them this is simply winter, harsh but survivable. The psychological toll cannot be overstated. In such extreme cold, every ritual of warmth became sacred. Drawing curtains around the bed wasn't just habit, it was survival. Sharing body heat with servants or pets wasn't just comfort, it was necessity. Heated stones weren't luxuries, they were lifelines. Each act, repeated nightly, reaffirmed the fragile barrier between life and the cold pressing against the walls. Historians still argue whether castles in these regions were symbols of power or prisons of stone. Were they admired as mighty fortresses or dreaded as icy tombs? The truth may be both. To live in such a place required resilience, but it also projected authority. If a king could endure here, surely he could endure anywhere. As you step back from the frosted window, listening to the storm's howl, you understand the 14th secret of royal winter survival. Location mattered. Castles in northern lands tested their inhabitants more brutally than any architectural detail or luxurious fur. Survival wasn't just about clever tricks inside. It was about bracing against the world outside, a world that never truly softened. The rustle of nightclothes and the creak of feather mattresses fade as you imagine stepping beyond the chamber walls. Now the castle itself becomes the stage, and you realize the true test of winter wasn't inside, it was outside. Castles in colder regions like Scotland, Scandinavia, or the northern reaches of Germany were fortresses of endurance. The wind here didn't whisper through cracks. It screamed, tearing across moors and fjords, howling through arrow slits like an uninvited ghost. Picture a snow-covered courtyard at midnight. The moon hangs low and pale, casting silver across the jagged battlements. Smoke curls lazily from narrow chimneys, but it's thin, shredded instantly by the wind. Guards huddle near braziers at the gate, their cloaks whipping around their ankles, spears rattling as they try not to freeze in place. Inside the castle walls, the situation is little better. Stone doesn't care about the suffering of kings. Cold creeps through mortar joints, slinks under doors, and pools in corners until it feels like the walls themselves are breathing ice. Mainstream history. Fact: castles in northern Europe were notoriously difficult to heat. Their massive halls and high ceilings allowed warm air to escape upward, while small windows minimized sunlight. Even with multiple fireplaces, temperatures inside could hover only slightly above freezing during winter storms. Accounts from visitors frequently described castles as drafty, smoky, and uncomfortable. Here's your quirky tidbit. In Scandinavian castles, it wasn't unusual for ice to form on interior walls, even inside bedchambers. Chroniclers note frost patterns stretching like lace across tapestries, while water buckets left in corners froze solid overnight. Imagine waking up in a supposedly warm chamber, only to see your breath crystallizing in the air like you'd been sleeping outdoors. Historians still ask whether royalty genuinely acclimated to such extreme cold, or whether they constantly sought escape. Some suggest nobles toughened themselves, learning to endure temperatures that would shock us today. Others argue that their endless layering of clothes, furs, and heated stones proves they never stopped fighting the chill. Either way, the records agree. No castle, no matter how grand, was immune to the brutality of northern winters. Step now into the great hall of a Scottish keep. Snow has piled outside, drifted against the heavy oak doors, and even seeped through the cracks. Inside, a fire roars, but the smoke chokes the air before slipping through a crude chimney. Nobles sit close to the flames, faces flushed red, while their backs shiver from draughts swirling behind. The further you move from the hearth, the colder it grows, until the hall feels like two different worlds, burning at the front, glacial at the back. The sensory details are sharp. The wind moans constantly through arrow slits, never letting you forget its presence. The smell of smoke clings to every garment, every tapestry, saturating the air until even the furs reek of firewood. Your feet crunch on frozen rushes, the straw stiff with frost, and everywhere you look, people's breath rises like mist, even indoors. Picture the royals themselves in these harsher climates. The King of Scotland might retreat into his solar, huddling beneath 4 layers of blankets, braziers arranged in a circle like guards made of fire. The Queen in Scandinavia might spend nights in smaller chambers lined with triple tapestries, her children bundled in adjoining nurseries, nurses pacing the floor to keep them from freezing. Even the most powerful had to bow before nature's severity. And so you uncover the 13th secret of royal winter survival. Clothing wasn't shed at night, it was embraced. Kings and queens slept not in naked splendor, but in layered defenses. Linen, wool, fur, gloves, caps, all stitched together into a cocoon of survival. Sleep wasn't a shedding of the day's burdens, it was a continuation of them, softened only by warmth, fabric, and the illusion that dignity could be maintained even with a tassel dangling from your nightcap. Now picture the moment the monarch crawls into bed, fully dressed in these layers. The heated stone still glows at the foot, the furs weigh heavy, and yet the gown and stockings remain necessary. Without them, the body would quickly lose heat. It wasn't unusual for people to sleep in almost full daytime attire during harsh winters. Nightwear blurred into daywear, and the idea of stripping down to bare skin would have been unthinkable in a castle where cold air seeped from every crack. Here's a humorous image. The king, swaddled in so many layers he looks more like a stuffed pillow than a monarch, tries to roll over in bed and gets stuck. He groans, waving an arm helplessly, while the queen mutters, "For heaven's sake, stop wriggling, you'll knock the brazier over." Even royalty could become clumsy victims of their own nightclothes. But nightwear wasn't just about warmth, it also symbolized continuity. By wearing rich fabrics even in bed, royals reinforced the idea that they were never truly ordinary. Imagine a visiting noble catching sight of the king in his woolen nightcap embroidered with gold thread. Even in sleepwear, the message was clear: I am wealthier, warmer, and holier than you. Historians still debate whether nightclothes were laundered frequently or rarely. Linen shifts, being easier to wash, were changed often, but wool gowns might have been worn for weeks. The layers absorbed sweat and smoke, meaning royals, like everyone else, probably carried the musty scent of winter survival. Cleanliness was relative, and warmth usually trumped freshness. You glance toward the servants again. Their nightwear is simpler. Woolen tunics, patched stockings, rough cloaks pulled tight around shoulders. Some wear nothing more than their work clothes, collapsing on straw after long days. The contrast is striking. The king glitters even in his gown, while the page beside his snores in rags. Yet both are bundled, layered, fighting the same battle against cold. The psychological effect of these layers is worth considering. Imagine falling asleep knowing you're wrapped not just in warmth, but in the physical evidence of your power. Each layer represents labor: sheep shorn, wool spun, garments dyed, cloth tailored, seams stitched. Dozens of hands contributed to the simple act of you lying warm in bed. Comfort was never solitary, it was collective, built on the effort of an entire economy. Another quirky note: in some places, royals wore charms sewn into their nightclothes, tiny embroidered symbols, pieces of cloth blessed by priests, or even small pouches of herbs stitched discreetly into hems. These were meant to guard against nightmares, evil spirits, or sudden illness during the night. Imagine the queen tugging her cloak closer, whispering a prayer, trusting that the charm on her sleeve would keep her safe while she slept. The sensory layering continues. You hear the rustle of fabric as gowns shift under furs. You see candlelight glint off gold thread embroidered into cuffs. You smell the faint mix of wool, herbs, and smoke. You feel the weight of garments pressing against skin, both protective and stifling. Every sensation reinforces the reality. Night in a medieval castle wasn't about stripping down and relaxing. It was about armoring yourself against the cold, even in dreams. Here's a final humorous thought. Imagine waking in the middle of the night, desperate for the chamber pot, and realizing it takes 5 minutes just to peel off enough layers to move freely. No wonder some royals simply ordered attendants to help in those awkward midnight moments. Even bodily needs became rituals of hierarchy. The echoes of dripping bathwater fade, and now your attention shifts to something far less glamorous but just as vital: what the royals actually wore to bed. You might think kings and queens drifted into sleep, draped in silks, embroidered with gold thread, glittering even in their dreams. The truth? Far more practical, though still layered with symbolism. Nightwear in medieval castles was as much about surviving the cold as it was about maintaining an image even in private. Picture it. The king, finished with his soak, dries off, and then attendants begin the careful layering of garments. First, a linen chemise or undershirt, soft against the skin. Over that, a long woolen nightgown, dyed indigo or russet, belted loosely at the waist. On colder nights, perhaps a second gown is added, thicker, rougher, but warmer. Then stockings woven of wool pulled up over legs that might otherwise stiffen with frost. Finally, a cap. Yes, the classic nightcap wasn't just for cartoons. A long, pointed wool or linen cap, sometimes with a tassel, covered the head to prevent heat from escaping. Without it, even a king could wake with ears stiff from cold. Mainstream history. Fact: medieval sleepwear wasn't standardized, but nobles often wore long gowns and caps, while commoners simply slept in their underclothes or even fully dressed. The concept of pajamas as we know them didn't exist in Europe until centuries later. What you wore to bed was usually just an extension of what you wore during the day, adjusted for comfort and warmth. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some royals wore gloves to bed. Imagine the king slipping into bed with fur-lined mittens, muttering about how frostbitten fingers wouldn't hold a sword very well come morning. Gloves, often trimmed with ermine or lined with fleece, became miniature sleeping bags for hands. Add socks, caps, and layered gowns, and you realize that even under furs, royals dressed like onions, layer after layer after layer. Historians still argue whether these nightclothes were purely practical or also ceremonial. Some suggest that royals maintained a sense of dignity even in private, wearing embroidered or dyed garments that marked their status. Others argue that practicality reigned supreme and that kings and queens, like everyone else, wore whatever was warmest, regardless of appearance. The truth probably lies between. Wealth afforded finer fabrics, but survival still demanded function. You watch as attendants fold the garments carefully. The queen slips into a saffron wool gown, its hem trailing slightly on the rush-strewn floor. Beneath it, her linen shift peeks out, white against gold. She adjusts the sleeves, then accepts a fur-lined cloak from her maid, fastening it at the chest. Her hair, brushed free of tangles, is tucked beneath a simple cap, teal against her pale face. Even now, she looks regal, but you know that beneath the layers, her choices are driven less by fashion than by the war against drafts. The sensory details are vivid. The wool is coarse, prickling slightly against the skin, but thick enough to trap heat. The linen underneath is smoother, cooler, a buffer between flesh and wool. The cap fits snug, almost tight, warming ears and scalp. The gloves smell faintly of lanolin, the natural oil in wool. Together the layers create a cocoon of warmth, but not without discomfort. Too many layers, and you sweat. Too few, and you freeze. Royals, despite their wealth, had to find the same balance as everyone else. Here's a humorous aside. Picture a servant tripping on a rush mat, spilling a bucket of steaming water onto another servant's feet. A yelp, a curse, muffled laughter from the corner. Even in the solemn chambers of royalty, accidents happened, and those accidents likely became whispered stories for years. But bathing wasn't just comfort, it was medical practice. Physicians of the time often recommended hot baths to balance humours, cure melancholy, or treat aching joints. Heat was considered therapeutic, driving out bad vapours and restoring vitality. A monarch might step into the tub not only to feel warm, but also to reassure himself that health was being preserved, that sickness could be kept at bay with steam and herbs. Historians still debate the frequency of such baths. Some chronicles describe kings who bathed weekly, even daily, while others mention rulers who preferred to mask odours with perfumes and powders, saving baths for rare occasions. The disparity highlights just how varied medieval life was. Comfort was as much a matter of personal taste as cultural practice. Now imagine the end of the ritual. The queen rises from the tub, water streaming down her arms, steam coiling around her like smoke. Servants rush forward with towels, linen warmed by the fire, wrapping her in soft folds. The tub is emptied, the water sloshing noisily as buckets are carried back down to the kitchens. The chamber floor is damp, smelling of wet wood and rosemary. But the queen reclines now in her warmed bed, body tingling with heat, spirit softened by rare indulgence. Here's another quirky note. Some castles had pipes that funneled water into chambers, primitive plumbing made of lead or wood, but in most cases baths remained manual efforts dependent on armies of servants. The presence of hot water in your room wasn't just about comfort, it was a visual reminder of your power, your ability to command labour, your separation from the peasants who broke ice on buckets just to wash their faces. The sensory layering continues. You hear dripping water echoing down the corridor. You feel the floor slick beneath your feet. You smell smoke, herbs, damp wood. You see the shimmer of candlelight in the puddles left behind. The bath is gone, but its ghost lingers in every detail of the chamber. Humour finds its place here too. Imagine the king falling asleep mid-soak, head lolling against the tub's rim, servants glancing nervously at one another before poking him awake with a ladle. Even monarchs, it seems, weren't immune to the soporific powers of hot water. And yet the bath was more than indulgence. It was ritual. To soak before sleep was to wash away the day, to step briefly into warmth that reminded you life could be gentle, not only hard. It was an attempt to reset body and mind before surrendering to the uncertainties of the night. Historians still argue whether the memory of warmth lingered long enough to make sleep genuinely easier, or whether it was fleeting, lost within an hour as the cold reclaimed the chamber. Either way, the experience mattered. In the psychology of survival, moments of respite were as important as constant heat. To believe you had found comfort, even temporarily, was to push back against despair. So you sit at the edge of the empty tub, reflecting. The tapestries, the braziers, the heated stones, all were weapons in the war against winter. But the bath was something different. It was not just defense. It was luxury, a rare offense against the cold, a deliberate drowning of discomfort in steaming water and fragrant herbs. And so you discover the 12th secret of royal winter survival. Sometimes survival meant creating pockets of indulgence, fleeting sanctuaries where heat was not borrowed from coals or stolen from furs, but poured bucket by bucket into a tub that turned a stone chamber into a spa. Temporary, impractical, labor-intensive, but unforgettable. The glow of the bed-warming stone fades in your imagination, and now you hear a different sound, water sloshing faintly in wooden buckets, the scrape of iron against stone, the grunt of servants lugging something heavy down the corridor. You turn, and there it is, a steaming wooden tub being rolled into the chamber, its staves bound tight with iron hoops, steam rising in lazy curls into the cold air. Tonight, the royals will bathe before bed, an indulgence not common but treasured when the season grew harsh. You step closer. The tub isn't large, no ornate marble baths here, no flowing fountains. It's just big enough for a king or queen to crouch and soak, knees pulled toward the chest, water lapping against the rim. But in a castle where chill seemed to breathe through the very walls, hot water was luxury itself. Heated in great cauldrons in the kitchens, bucket after bucket had to be hauled upstairs by sweating servants. Imagine the effort, dozens of trips, men stumbling on frozen steps, spilling steaming water that hissed as it touched the icy stone floors. By the time the tub was full, half the castle staff had contributed to the task. Mainstream history. Fact: bathing in medieval Europe was rarer than we might expect, though not entirely absent. Royals and nobles bathed more frequently than peasants, often in wooden tubs lined with cloth or scented herbs. Warm water was a comfort, a medical treatment, and occasionally a luxury performance of wealth. Some castles even had semi-permanent bathhouses, though for winter nights like this, tubs in bedchambers were more common. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some nobles believed certain herbs steeped in bathwater could guard against illness. Sage, chamomile, rosemary, and even slices of citrus were sometimes added, creating what we might call the medieval version of bath bombs. Imagine a queen sighing in relief as attendants pour rosemary-infused water over her shoulders, convinced it will keep away fevers and perhaps even bad dreams. Historians still argue whether these baths were about hygiene or comfort. Some sources insist that nobles bathed frequently for cleanliness, while others stress the rarity of such events, portraying them as ceremonial luxuries rather than daily habits. The truth likely lies somewhere between. Practical necessity sometimes met indulgence, depending on the season, the resources, and the ruler's temperament. You kneel beside the tub and take in the sensory world. The water steams, filling the room with mist that beads on tapestries and makes candle flames tremble. The smell of heated herbs drifts upward, sharp and green, cutting through the must of stone and fir. The wood creaks as the tub shifts under its weight, groaning like an old ship at sea. Your skin prickles at the thought of dipping into such warmth after hours in the cold. Picture the queen entering the chamber, shedding her woolen gown with the help of her ladies. She steps gingerly into the tub, sighing as the heat embraces her body. Servants stand nearby with towels, ready to pour more hot water from iron kettles whenever the temperature cools. Outside, the wind howls against the shutters, but inside, the queen floats in a cocoon of steam. For a brief hour she might forget the draughts, the weight of furs, the sting of frost. Meanwhile, the king might take his turn later. Or perhaps he has his own tub in a separate chamber. Gender and decorum dictated such arrangements, though practicality often bent the rules. Imagine the humour of two tubs set up side by side, husband and wife soaking in silence while servants scurried back and forth like frantic bees. The scene is intimate, absurd, and deeply human all at once. Here's a humorous scene. The king climbs into bed and accidentally kicks the hot stone. He yelps, cursing, startling the queen. Servants rush forward, tripping over each other, one fumbling to pull the glowing rock out with tongs while muttering apologies. In the corner, a page tries not to laugh, knowing he'll be punished if he does. Even the most regal figures couldn't escape the comedy of domestic accidents. But beneath the humour lies ingenuity. In a castle where stone walls radiated cold and draughts crept in no matter how many shutters you closed, warmth was about creating layers of defences. A heated stone was one such layer, a temporary movable pocket of heat that made sleep possible. Royals weren't above these hacks. They relied on them as much as anyone. Historians note that warming rituals varied across Europe. In northern regions, stones were more common. In southern lands, heated pots or even bricks wrapped in fur might be used. Some sources describe nobles travelling with their own bed-warming tools, packed into carriages alongside tapestries and trunks of clothing. Imagine a caravan of wealth rattling down a snowy road, one chest reserved entirely for rocks. Practical, absurd, and deeply human. The psychology of the ritual is fascinating. To slip into a bed already warmed by servants was not only physical relief, but also symbolic. It reminded the monarch that others had gone ahead, softened the way, made life tolerable. Every warmed sheet was proof of hierarchy. Someone else carried the coals, someone else risked burns, someone else ensured the royal feet would not freeze. Even in sleep, power expressed itself in comfort. Yet even kings weren't fully spared. Once the stone cooled in the middle of the night, the cold returned. Some royals called for replacements, rousing servants to fetch fresh coals. Others endured, curling tighter beneath furs, pulling. Curtains tighter around the bed. Comfort was always temporary, and survival was always a negotiation. Here's another quirky note. In folklore, warmed stones were sometimes thought to chase away spirits or illness. Heat was seen as purifying, a force that cleansed both the body and the room. To slide a heated stone beneath the covers wasn't just about warming flesh, it was about warding off invisible dangers that haunted the night. Imagine yourself lying in that bed now. The weight of furs presses down, the curtains seal you in, and at your feet a stone glows faintly, wrapping your toes in gentle warmth. For a brief moment you feel suspended between extremes, the storm rattling the shutters outside and the cocoon of comfort inside. Sleep comes easier, not because the castle has become warm, but because you've carved out a pocket of resistance against the cold. Historians still debate whether the invention of bed-warming tools marked a turning point in medieval domestic life. Did it make winters meaningfully more bearable, or was it just one small comfort in a world still dominated by frost? Either way, it shows how even the simplest technology, stone, fire, cloth, could transform the royal experience of night. You lean back and reflect. The brazier, the tapestries, the shutters, the furs, and now the heated stone, all of these are part of the same story. A layering of defences, each imperfect, each fleeting, but together making survival possible. Royals weren't insulated by wealth alone, they were insulated by rituals, servants, and the creativity of people who refused to freeze in silence. And so you discover the 11th secret of royal winter survival. Warmth was engineered, one glowing stone at a time. It wasn't grand architecture or divine right that kept kings and queens alive in the dead of winter. It was the humble ingenuity of heated rocks tucked beneath linen, the quiet sigh of relief when cold feet finally found warmth, and the endless repetition of small acts that made life tolerable behind freezing walls. The quiet breathing of servants fades into the background as your eyes drift to a curious ritual. A maid enters, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle that glows faintly in the dim chamber light. She unwraps it carefully, and you realize it's a heated stone, smooth, brick-like, pulled straight from the fireplace, still radiating warmth like the heart of a captured flame. She kneels beside the bed, slides the glowing brick beneath the sheets, and tucks it discreetly near the foot of the royal mattress. For a moment, the entire chamber seems to sigh. Imagine the bliss of slipping frozen feet onto that pocket of heat, the relief seeping into your bones like sunlight after a storm. In a world without radiators, without heated floors, without even the certainty that the fire would last until morning, this simple trick was revolutionary. The bed, already a fortress of curtains and furs, now had a secret weapon, a low-tech hot water bottle made of stone. Mainstream history fact, bed-warming stones or bed warmers were common in medieval Europe, especially in wealthy households. These stones were heated in the hearth, then wrapped in cloth or placed in metal containers to be carried safely into the bedchamber. Some were set directly under the covers, others placed beneath the mattress or inside wooden frames. Their purpose was simple: provide localized warmth to fight the chill of winter nights. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some places, people didn't use stones at all. They used pans filled with glowing coals. These bedpans had long handles so they could be slid under covers and swirled around to warm the sheets evenly. Effective? Yes. Risky? Also yes. More than one household recorded fires or singed bedding from over-enthusiastic warming. You can imagine the awkward explanation: "Majesty, forgive the smoke. We accidentally set your bed ablaze while trying to make it comfortable." Historians still argue about the exact prevalence of bed-warming stones among the highest nobility. Some claim they were used nightly, essential tools of comfort. Others suggest they were occasional luxuries brought out only in the harshest winters. Archaeological finds of scorched containers and hearth-shaped stones support both views. The truth is likely that kings and queens, like everyone else, did whatever it took to feel warm, even if that meant risking a smouldering mattress. You lean closer to the scene. The maid places the stone with reverence, ensuring it rests securely so it won't roll around. She adjusts the furs and nods to herself, satisfied. Now when the monarch slides into bed, the initial shock of icy linen will be replaced with gentle heat. For a few hours at least, comfort will outweigh discomfort. The sensory details draw you in. You can almost feel the warmth radiating through the fabric, faint but steady. The sheets smell faintly of smoke from the fireplace, mingling with the musky scent of fur. The stone itself emits a subtle crackle as tiny fragments of ash flake away. When the bed is finally occupied, the sleeper's sigh of relief is audible, proof that small gestures made the difference between misery and survival. Picture the logistics. Servants had to time the warming carefully. Too early, and the stone cooled before the monarch arrived. Too late, and it risked scorching fabric or feet. Attendants probably rehearsed this ritual, learning the perfect moment to sneak the stone beneath the sheets and remove it in the morning before it turned cold and clammy. Their precision turned a lump of rock into a tool of near-magical comfort, and yet there was camaraderie here too. When the royals finally drifted into slumber, the servants whispered to one another, quiet jokes, murmured prayers, maybe gossip about the day's feast. Imagine them lying in the dark, grinning as they whispered about the nobleman who spilled wine down his tunic, or the lady whose wig nearly caught fire from the hearth. These moments of humour were survival too. Here's a humorous image. The king wakes suddenly, shouting for more blankets. Servants scramble, half asleep, tripping over each other in the dark, tossing cloaks onto the royal bed until the monarch disappears entirely beneath a mound of wool. The hound barks, one page stumbles into the brazier, and for a moment chaos reigns in what was supposed to be a restful night. Even the mightiest chambers had their slapstick moments. But the arrangement had deeper meaning. Servants lying nearby were not only functional, they were symbolic. Their presence demonstrated the king's importance. Who else needed a small squadron just to make it through the night? The greater the number of attendants, the greater the perceived vulnerability, and thus the greater the power implied. Protection was a performance as much as necessity. Historians still debate whether this constant closeness blurred social boundaries. Did servants grow attached to their masters in these long nights, fostering bonds of loyalty? Or did resentment simmer, knowing they froze on straw while their monarch reclined on feathers and fur? Accounts suggest both. Some attendants became fiercely loyal, remembered in chronicles for their devotion. Others betrayed their masters in moments of ambition or despair. The intimacy of the chamber was a double-edged sword. Connection could cut either way. You imagine the queen glancing from her bed toward the corner where her ladies lie curled together. She sees their breath rising. In unison, hears their soft snores and feels a pang of recognition. Beneath all the wealth and ritual, bodies are bodies, cold, tired, craving warmth. Even surrounded by walls of stone and symbols of power, the human need for rest levels the playing field more than crowns ever could. The chamber feels different once you notice this. It's no longer just a royal sanctuary, it's a hive. Life hums quietly in every corner, warmth pooled in every sleeping body. The king and queen might be at the center, but the servants orbit like moons, their presence gravitational, keeping the royal world spinning. Another quirky note. In some courts, children of noble families were placed as attendants, sleeping in royal chambers not only as helpers but as living hostages of loyalty. Their families pledged allegiance by sending their sons and daughters to serve. Imagine being 12, trying to keep warm on straw while your king snores behind velvet curtains, knowing your very presence there is both service and insurance against rebellion. The more you take in, the clearer it becomes. This wasn't solitude, it was community. Royals might have pretended to sleep in splendid isolation, but in reality they were never truly alone. Night after night, the chamber pulsed with whispers, sighs, shifting straw, barking dogs, crackling braziers. And so you discover the 10th secret of royal winter survival. Sleep was a group effort. The warmth of attendants, the vigilance of guards, the quiet companionship of animals, all of it wrapped around the monarch like invisible layers of bedding. In a freezing castle, comfort came not just from furs and fires, but from people, loyal, weary, indispensable. The shuttered window rattles softly behind you as you shift your attention toward another subtle detail of royal life in winter. The quiet presence of servants sleeping nearby. You might think kings and queens enjoyed absolute privacy, tucked into their chambers with nothing but silence for company. The truth was far different. Where there was royalty, there were attendants, always. And when night fell, many of those attendants remained in the room or just outside, ready to respond to the smallest need. Picture it now. A chamber dimly lit by a fading brazier, the royal bed cloaked in furs and curtains. Along one wall, on straw pallets or narrow benches, lie several figures in various states of rest. One maid snores softly, curled into a ball beneath a woolen cloak dyed russet. Another young page shivers under a thin blanket, his knees drawn to his chest, one hand resting against the hilt of a dagger. A faithful hound lies sprawled across his feet, its body warmth almost more valuable than the wool. This isn't laziness, this is strategy. To sleep near royalty meant to be instantly available, doubling as both protection and comfort. Mainstream history. Fact. It was common practice for attendants to sleep in or near royal chambers, particularly in winter. Their duties ranged from stoking fires, fetching warm drinks, and delivering chamber pots to guarding against assassins or intruders. Servants were extensions of the royal body, ready to serve, ready to warm, ready to shield. The chamber wasn't truly private, it was a living organism of bodies and roles, all clustered around the king or queen. Here's your quirky tidbit. Sometimes attendants were chosen specifically for their ability to keep warm. In certain courts, pages or ladies in waiting were nicknamed bed warmers because they literally slipped into the royal bed ahead of time, heating it with their own bodies before the monarch arrived. The practice sounds scandalous to modern ears, but in the Middle Ages it was practical, if slightly awkward. Imagine being the chosen teenager who spends half an hour turning yourself into a human hot water bottle for your sovereign. Historians still argue whether the presence of servants made chambers feel safer or more invasive. On the one hand, attendants offered immediate security. On the other, they stripped away privacy, forcing royals to live constantly under observation. Was it comforting to know someone could add wood to the fire at a moment's notice? Or was it unsettling to sense eyes and ears lingering even while you slept? The balance of comfort and vulnerability is still debated. You crouch closer to one of the servants on the floor. He's just a boy, no more than 15, his cloak pulled tight over his head. His face is pale with cold, but the steady rise and fall of his chest shows he's used to it. This boy isn't just there to warm the chamber, he's also a reminder that royal life depended on an army of invisible workers, each sacrificing their own comfort to protect the illusion of the monarchs. The sensory details are intimate. You hear the soft sighs of sleepers, the occasional cough echoing in the cold air. The rushes on the floor rustle whenever someone shifts position. The hound growls faintly in its sleep, chasing imaginary hares. You smell wool warmed by bodies, a musky, earthy scent that mixes with the smoke of the brazier. The chamber is layered with life, royal and servant alike sharing the same cold air, the same night. Picture the routines. A maid might wake at intervals to check the coals, carefully adding more fuel so the brazier didn't die out. A page might rise to pour wine into a goblet if the king stirred restlessly. Another servant might slip into the queen's adjoining chamber to adjust her curtains. These weren't dramatic acts. They were small, constant touches of care. Sleep for the servants was always light, ears trained for the faintest command. The architectural design of these windows also added to the discomfort. Because they were arrow loops, they funneled sound. The cries of the wind were amplified, turning ordinary storms into ghostly wails that echoed through the chamber. It's easy to see how legends of haunted castles grew from these nightly noises. Sleep beside a shutter long enough, and you'd start to believe spirits really were clawing at the walls. Historians note that as glass became more common in the 15th and 16th centuries, castles slowly began to tame the cold. Larger windows with leaded panes allowed light without the same constant drafts, but during the earlier medieval centuries, shutters remained the norm, and the nightly ritual of sealing them tight was as essential as pulling furs across the bed. Picture the Queen's ladies in waiting performing this duty. Two of them wrestle with the heavy shutters, while another holds a candle to light the latch. The candle sputters, nearly going out in the gust that sneaks through. Their hands are red with cold, breath fogging the air as they curse under their breath. But finally, the wood slams into place and the chamber sighs into stillness. For the royals, this is invisible labour. For the servants, it's nightly battle. Here's another quirky note. Some shutters were carved with small spy holes or ventilation slots. These could be opened slightly to let in air without exposing the entire window. Of course, ventilation in a medieval winter mostly meant freezing draft, so you wonder how often these were actually used. The debate among historians continues. Were these shuttered rooms truly unbearable, or did people adapt so fully that they stopped noticing? Did royals lie awake, teeth chattering, muttering curses at the stone around them, or did they simply accept the cold as normal, comforted by the knowledge that everyone outside the castle alls had it even worse? Evidence suggests both. Complaints in letters, but also records of people sleeping soundly in what we'd call frigid conditions. You take one last look at the shuttered slit. Its wooden face is scarred by frost, its iron latch gleaming faintly in the firelight. Behind it the storm still rages, but inside the room is muted, the world reduced to coals, furs and whispers. It's not warmth, not really, but it's survival. And in this, you discover the 9th secret of royal winter survival. Shutting out the world was as important as heating the room. Close the shutters, seal the cracks, and for a moment the illusion of comfort could be sustained. Not perfection, not luxury, but enough. Enough to let kings and queens lie back, draw their curtains tight, and pretend, if only for a few hours, that winter had been kept outside the walls. You step away from the glowing tapestries and glance toward the far wall, where the outline of a narrow window cuts through the stone. At first, it looks like a slit, no wider than your hand, barely large enough to glimpse the sky. These were arrow loops designed to let defenders shoot out without letting attackers shoot in. But at night, in the middle of winter, they were something else entirely. Icy funnels that invited the wind to whistle straight into the chamber. A servant moves closer, pulling at a pair of heavy wooden shutters. They creak loudly as though protesting the effort and slam shut with a deep, echoing thud. A latch of iron falls into place, sealing the opening against the storm outside. The moment the shutters close, the draft lessens. The room feels calmer, though the chill never fully vanishes. You can still sense the cold pressing against the wood, trying to sneak in around the edges. Mainstream history fact: most medieval castles did not have glass windows until the late Middle Ages. Before that, openings were covered with wooden shutters, cloth soaked in wax or oil, or thin horn panels that let in some light but kept out less cold than you'd hope. By the 14th century, wealthy nobles began to install glass panes, but they were small, expensive, and often reserved for chapels or the richest chambers. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some castles stuffed windows with parchment or stretched animal bladder when glass wasn't available. Imagine looking out at the snowy courtyard through a membrane of sheep's stomach. The light warped and yellowed. It wasn't pretty, but it kept the worst drafts out. Think of it as the medieval version of cling film taped over your window in a winter emergency. Historians still argue whether these coverings actually made much difference in terms of temperature. Some experiments with reconstructed castles suggest that even shuttered windows leaked cold constantly, turning entire rooms into draft tunnels. Others believe that combined with tapestries and bed curtains, the effect was enough to create tolerable warmth. What's certain is that no one living in a castle during winter would describe it as cozy. You walk closer to the shuttered slit, feeling along the edges. The wood is rough, scarred from years of use, and the iron latch is cold enough to burn your skin. Beyond it, you can hear the wind shrieking through the battlements, rattling the timbers, and carrying with it the muffled howls of wolves. Snow swirls just outside, tiny crystals slipping through cracks and scattering across the floor. A servant brushes them away with a broom, muttering under his breath. Now imagine being the royal who has to sleep only feet from that shutter. Even with furs, braziers and curtains, you'd hear the constant rattle of wood against iron, feel the creeping fingers of frost at the edge of your bed. And if the storm worsened, the shutters might even strain against the wind, threatening to burst open with a sudden bang. A restful night? Unlikely, more like a battle of nerves between your blankets and the elements. The sensory world of the window is stark. The shutter groans like an old man every time the wind shifts. The cold leaks through, so sharp that it feels like knives pressing against your cheek. The smell of snow lingers, crisp and metallic, mixing with the smoke of the brazier. Every now and then the firelight flickers as a draught sneaks past, sending shadows dancing across the embroidered saints on the walls. Here's a moment of humour. Imagine a king waking in the night to find snow piling inside his chamber because a careless servant left the shutters unlatched. You'd hear the royal grumble, "For heaven's sake, are we living in a barn?" as attendants scramble to hammer the wood closed. Again, even kings, it seems, were at the mercy of weather and forgetfulness. So here you uncover the 8th secret of royal winter survival. Warmth came not just from fire or fur, but from stories stitched into fabric. The walls themselves were dressed against the cold, turning survival into art, turning necessity into beauty. As you trace the golden threads with your eyes, you realize, even in a freezing fortress, humans found ways to weave comfort from color, cloth, and imagination. So here you uncover the 8th secret of royal winter survival. Warmth came not just from fire or fur, but from stories stitched into fabric. The walls themselves were dressed against the cold, turning survival into art, turning necessity into beauty. As you trace the golden threads with your eyes, you realize, even in a freezing fortress, humans found ways to weave comfort from color, cloth, and imagination. Here's a humorous thought. Imagine being a medieval teenager tasked with tapestry duty. You're dragging a rolled-up rug taller than yourself across a freezing corridor, cursing under your breath while your master reminds you to handle it gently. That's French work. By the time you hang it, you're sweaty, exhausted, and too tired to appreciate the hunting scene you just nailed to the wall. The role of tapestries extended beyond warmth. They were storytelling devices, portable history books, political propaganda. A king might display tapestries of past victories, reminding visitors of his lineage and might. A queen might commission hangings of saints or biblical stories, underlining her piety. Guests didn't just admire the art, they read it like a message. This family is powerful, this castle is holy, this bedchamber is civilized despite the howling wind outside. Historians still debate whether some of the most famous tapestries, like the Bayeux tapestry, were meant primarily as propaganda or as decoration. In truth, they were probably both. Function and message blended seamlessly in these woven walls. You couldn't separate survival from symbolism. The contrast between spaces with and without tapestries is dramatic. Walk into a bare corridor and every whisper echoes, every draught cuts to the bone. Step into a chamber lined with hangings and the acoustics change. The sound is softer, muffled, the cold slightly muted. Even if the temperature isn't much different, the feeling of warmth is undeniable. It's psychological insulation, and that counts for a lot when you're trying to drift into sleep. Imagine yourself lying in bed, staring at a tapestry illuminated by candlelight. The figures seem to move, shadows flickering across their faces. The hunter raises his spear as if about to strike. The saint lifts his hand in blessing. The weave of threads shifts subtly with Evie. Eerie draught, turning still pictures into animated guardians of the night. It's not hard to see how imagination could run wild in these rooms, fueling dreams or nightmares depending on the weave. Here's another quirky note. Tapestries sometimes doubled as room dividers. Hung across spaces, they could create smaller, cozier enclosures inside vast halls. Picture a royal couple drawing a curtain around their bed within a tapestry-lined alcove, turning a cavernous hall into something that felt almost intimate. It was architecture by fabric, a way of reshaping stone with wool and dye. Now let's address the human side again. Servants often slept near or even behind these hangings, using them as makeshift shelters against drafts. You picture a maid curling up behind a tapestry of saints, hidden from sight, basking in the small pocket of warmth it created. In this sense, the tapestry wasn't just for nobles. It was a shared defense against winter, a communal blanket stretched across walls instead of bodies. Historians still debate whether the artistry of tapestries was appreciated as deeply at the time as we value it now. Were they treasured masterpieces, or were they simply functional decor, admired but taken for granted? Surviving records suggest both. Nobles spent fortunes on them, but servants likely saw them as heavy, awkward necessities that just happened to be pretty. You step back, gazing at the chamber again. The tapestries transform it. Without them, it would be an austere stone box, cold and echoing. With them, it's softened, humanized, warmed both literally and symbolically. They are, in a way, the castle's clothing, dressing bare stone in rich fabric, protecting the body of the building the way furs protected the body of its occupants. You leave the glow of the brazier behind and turn your gaze toward the walls. At first glance, they're just endless slabs of stone, grey, cold and unyielding. But then you notice the rich tapestries that hang like giant rugs turned upright, stitched with colours so deep they almost shimmer in the firelight. Here, against the walls, lies another secret of royal survival, the warmth of woven pictures. The tapestry nearest you shows a hunting scene. Men in russet cloaks ride horses through a forest, hounds leaping forward, stags cornered in the weave of threads. It's more than decoration, it's insulation. Each layer of thick wool or linen keeps the cold from radiating inward, turning the wall from an icebox into something closer to bearable. You run your fingers across the surface, and it's warmer than bare stone, textured like a rug, each stitch a barrier against winter's persistence. Mainstream history fact: tapestries were among the most important furnishings in medieval castles. They weren't just art, they were functional. By hanging them along exterior walls, nobles could reduce drafts, trap heat, and even create smaller, warmer zones within large chambers. Some castles used wall hangings so heavy that moving them required teams of servants. Here's your quirky tidbit. These tapestries were often portable. Nobles rolled them up and took them on journeys, unfurling them in whatever guest chambers they occupied. Imagine travelling from one freezing fortress to another, arriving with trunks not of clothes alone, but of giant wall carpets, ready to turn any stone box into something more comfortable. They were the medieval equivalent of carrying a space heater in your suitcase. Historians still argue how effective tapestries really were at keeping rooms warm. Some claim they genuinely raised temperatures by several degrees, enough to make a meaningful difference. Others sue. Just the effect was more psychological than physical. People felt warmer surrounded by soft, colourful fabric rather than bare stone. Either way, their popularity across Europe is undeniable proof that nobles valued them as much for survival as for beauty. You step closer to another tapestry. This one shows saints in halos, glowing gold against a deep indigo sky. The gold thread sparkles faintly in the light of the brazier. It's devotional as much as decorative, a reminder of divine protection even as you shiver beneath furs. Imagine lying in bed, glancing up at these sacred images and convincing yourself that warmth wasn't just physical, it was spiritual too. The sensory experience is vivid. The wool is thick, slightly scratchy under your palm. The dyes are rich, saffron yellow, teal blue, russet brown. The smell is faintly musty, like aged fabric stored in chests for years, and behind the tapestry, when you lift a corner, the wall is cold enough to sting your fingertips. The difference is immediate. Covered, the wall feels muted. Uncovered, It's like pressing against an ice cube the size of a cathedral. Picture the servants tasked with maintaining these tapestries. They shook them out regularly to remove dust, sometimes beating them outdoors like rugs. They patched holes, re-dyed faded sections, and replaced hangings seasonally. In summer, lighter fabrics might be used. In winter, the heaviest wool or linen came out, layered thick across every surface. The cycle of hanging and rehanging was as much a part of castle life as stoking fires or laying rushes on floors. The sensory details overwhelm you, the crackle of the coals, the faint hiss when a drop of melted snow from a servant's boot lands on them, the smoky tang sharp in the nose making your eyes water, the flicker of red light against the bed curtains turning gold thread into molten fire. It's both comforting and ominous, beauty edged with danger. And here's a bit of humour. Imagine waking in the night, kicking your furs off in frustration and knocking straight into the brazier. Your chamber fills with sparks, the servants panic, and you, the ruler of an entire kingdom, are suddenly hopping on one foot, cursing under your breath. Medieval life had a way of humbling even the highest born. The brazier, though, is more than just a heater. It's a reminder of how precious fire was. Outside these walls, peasants huddled around smoky hearths, sharing warmth with livestock. In the castle, fire became portable, personal, almost ceremonial. To bring a brazier into the bedchamber wasn't just about surviving the night, it was about asserting mastery over an element that otherwise dominated your life. Historians point out that many castles lacked large, efficient fireplaces until the later Middle Ages. Earlier structures relied heavily on braziers, making them central to daily life. Even with improved chimneys, the brazier remained popular for its mobility. Need to warm a chamber quickly? Carry in a brazier. Want to keep your hands warm while writing a letter at night? Place a brazier under the table. Cold feet before sleep? Slide a fire pan between the covers. It was versatile technology, simple but effective. But the debates about their safety never ended. Some chroniclers mention fires sparked by tipped braziers, destroying chambers, or even entire wings of castles. Others describe nobles suffocating mysteriously in their sleep, hinting that the smoke might have been the culprit. Still, for every risk there was the undeniable reward, warmth in a place that otherwise offered very little of it. You picture the scene more vividly now. The king reclines against a pile of cushions, sipping spiced wine as the brazier glows beside him. The queen draws her mantle tighter, basking in the warmth, while ladies-in-waiting gossip softly near another coal pan. Guards linger by the door, stamping their feet against the cold, envious of the glowing bowls they're not allowed to touch. The room is a patchwork of heat and cold, light and shadow, life and risk. And here's another quirky note. Sometimes braziers were decorated with elaborate designs featuring engraved animals, saints, or heraldic symbols. Imagine a pan of coals glowing through cut-out shapes of lions or crosses, turning a utilitarian object into a work of art. Even heat, it seems, could be a display of status. You lean back, absorbing the moment. The brazier hisses softly, the coals shifting, their glow fading slowly as they burn down. The warmth is temporary, fleeting, but no less precious for it. And in that fleeting comfort, you understand the seventh secret of royal winter survival. Warmth was carried, not guaranteed. Fire had to be tamed, moved, managed, and constantly renewed. In the cold heart of a castle, a brazier was more than an object. It was a lifeline, glowing faintly against the stone's eternal chill. The straw crunch fades as you drift further into the chamber, and now your eyes catch the glow of something unusual. A faint red-orange shimmer moving in the hands of a servant. At first you think it's another torch, but no, this is smaller, more contained, almost secretive. The man carries a shallow iron pan on 3 legs filled with glowing coals. Sparks flare when he walks too fast, and the smell of hot metal mingles with the sharper scent of smoke. This is the portable brazier, the medieval answer to the question, how do you bring the fire closer to bed without burning the entire castle down? The servant crouches and sets it down gently beside the royal bed, careful not to let the embers spill onto the rush-covered floor. The coals crackle, throwing off a wave of heat that radiates only a few feet. You kneel closer and feel it wash against your skin, soothing compared to the icy air around. It's a crude comfort, but comfort nonetheless. Imagine being a king or queen lying beneath layers of fur, with the added warmth of coals just within reach. It's not central heating, but in a stone chamber, it could feel like a miracle. Mainstream history fact: portable braziers and fire pans were widely used in castles to provide localized heat. Made of iron, bronze, or even clay, they were filled with charcoal or wood embers taken from the main hearth. Servants carried them from room to room, creating small islands of warmth in otherwise freezing spaces. These weren't decorative luxuries, they were survival tools. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some nobles used perfumed coals in their braziers, adding herbs, spices, or even resin to make the heat aromatic. Imagine a queen drifting to sleep with the scent of rosemary or frankincense filling the chamber, the brazier acting as both heater and primitive air freshener. Of course, too much fragrance could choke the air, and more than one medieval physician warned against excessive vapors. Still, it's strangely relatable. Who doesn't want a candle or diffuser near their bed today? Historians still argue about the safety of these devices. On one hand, braziers provided essential warmth. On the other, they posed obvious risks: burns, fires, and even suffocation from carbon monoxide in poorly ventilated rooms. Was the risk worth the reward? Some argue yes, pointing to their widespread use. Others note that accounts of sudden nighttime deaths could, at least occasionally, be linked to these smoky companions. The debate lingers, and with good reason. Imagine falling asleep beside a glowing pan of embers. Comforting, yes, but also slightly terrifying. You lean closer to study the brazier. Its legs are twisted iron, hammered into elegant curls by a blacksmith who understood both strength and artistry. The pan itself is shallow, filled with a bed of glowing charcoal that pulses red with every shift of air. Above it, the heat ripples faintly, distorting the air like a mirage. You stretch your hand toward it and pull back quickly. It's too hot to touch, but the warmth reaches you, filling the space between your fingers and face, proof that fire, even contained, remains a living thing. Now picture how the scene plays out nightly. Servants shuffle in carrying one or more braziers, sometimes setting them around the bed like protective guardians of warmth. They might also tuck smaller fire pans beneath the covers before the royals entered, heating the sheets directly. Picture a maid sliding a metal pan between linen and fur, then whisking it out just before the king climbs in. It's the medieval version of an electric blanket, except made of glowing coals that could scorch fabric if you weren't careful. The sensory details pile up. The straw prickles against your skin, leaving tiny scratches on arms and legs. Dust rises with every shift, making you sneeze. Somewhere in the straw, a flea hops, looking for its next victim. You swat half-heartedly, reminding yourself that even royalty dealt with these nuisances. Fleas and lice were the great equalizers of the medieval world. A crown on your head didn't stop the itching. But the straw had its virtues. It was cheap, renewable, and plentiful. After harvest, fields yielded mountains of stalks which could be stuffed into bedding, spread on floors, or even woven into makeshift mats. When the straw grew too dirty or flat, it could be burned as fuel or thrown into the dung heap. It was disposable comfort, basic but vital. Here's a humorous thought. Imagine trying to fluff your straw mattress. You slap it a few times, redistribute the lumps, and convince yourself it feels better. Tomorrow night the lumps will be back, in entirely new places. It's the medieval version of fighting with your pillow, except your pillow is full of weeds and bugs. Historians still discuss whether people actually slept better in those times, despite the conditions. Some argue that natural rhythms, going to bed earlier, rising with the sun, breaking sleep into 2 shifts, meant people felt rested in ways we no longer do. Others counter that constant cold, pests and discomfort must have made sleep shallow and restless. The answer likely lies somewhere in between. Medieval sleep was different, not necessarily better or worse, but adapted to the environment. You imagine yourself lying there staring at the canopy overhead if you're royal, or the dark ceiling beams if you're a servant. The castle creaks with winter, its stones expanding and contracting in the cold. A draught whistles through a shutter, brushing your face. You shift on the straw, hearing Tew. He crunch beneath you, the sound strangely soothing in its regularity. Sleep comes eventually, not because the bed is comfortable, but because exhaustion is universal. Another quirky note. Some people stuffed mattresses not with straw but with reeds, moss, or even seaweed in coastal areas. These materials had different textures and scents, adding variety to medieval sleep culture. Imagine resting your head on a moss-filled pillow, damp and earthy, but perhaps softer than plain straw. It's not Tempur-Pedic, but it's something. And here's where the scene turns reflective. You realize that comfort is relative. For peasants used to bare floors, a straw pallet was luxury. For servants, sleeping near a brazier while on straw was preferable to a cold corner. For royalty, feathers and furs were the pinnacle of wealth, even if they still itched and smelled. The hierarchy of bedding mirrored the hierarchy of society, layered, unequal, yet interconnected. So as you shift once more, listening to the straw crunch, you uncover the 6th secret of royal winter survival. Beneath all the grandeur, sleep was a struggle for everyone. Whether wrapped in ermine or curled on straw, the human body longed for warmth and rest, and the solutions, grand or humble, were surprisingly alike. You close your eyes, feeling the uneven mattress beneath you, and accept that sometimes survival meant learning to sleep on prickles and pretending it was comfort. You shift beneath the mountain of furs and step, at least in imagination, out of the royal bed. Your feet hit the floor and the illusion of comfort shatters instantly. The stone beneath is so cold it burns, the kind of shock that shoots up your legs like an icy knife. You glance down and realize why medieval people dreaded their first step in the morning. No slippers, no carpets, no heated flooring, just raw stone and, if you were lucky, a scattering of straw to soften the sting. This is where the divide between royalty and commoners blurs for a moment. While a king might recline on feather mattresses, ordinary folk relied on little more than straw stuffed into a cloth sack, what we'd call a straw mattress. Even in royal chambers, servants often slept nearby on straw pallets, close enough to attend to their master's needs, but far enough to pretend they had privacy. The crunch of straw under shifting bodies would have been a familiar nighttime soundtrack, more rustic than regal, but necessary in a world where space was limited and warmth was precious. Mainstream history fact: straw mattresses, often called palliasses, were the most common form of bedding throughout medieval Europe. Stuffed with oat, rye, or wheat straw, they had to be replaced regularly because pests, mold, and simple wear would turn them into uncomfortable, bug-ridden sacks. In wealthier homes, the straw might be layered with feathers or wool for extra cushioning, but at their core, these beds were basic, temporary, and surprisingly scratchy. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some households mixed dried herbs into the straw, things like lavender, wormwood, or mint. Supposedly, this wasn't just for fragrance. Herbs were believed to deter fleas, lice, and even evil spirits. Imagine lying down on a bed that smells faintly of mint and hay, convincing yourself that the aroma alone will keep nightmares and vermin away. Whether it worked is debatable, but at least the room smelled marginally fresher. Historians still argue whether straw bedding was actually tolerable or whether people just accepted discomfort as normal. Was it really as miserable as it sounds to our modern sensibilities, or did medieval folk simply sleep differently, accustomed to hardness and itchiness in ways we can't fathom? The accounts vary. Some describe straw mattresses as serviceable, while others paint them as bug hotels best left untouched. The debate, in truth, probably reflects the vast differences between rich and poor, castle and cottage. You crouch and press your hand into one of these straw pallets, and it crunches audibly, the stalks shifting and breaking beneath your weight. It's lumpy, uneven, but not without a certain earthy charm. The smell is strong, dry grass, dust, and a hint of whatever herbs were tossed in. Now imagine lying on this night after night with only a thin linen sheet between you and the straw, listening to the occasional scuttle of something you'd rather not think about. Meanwhile, your eyes drift to the king's bed again. His mattress might be feather-stuffed, smooth and carefully fluffed by attendants, but even he isn't entirely spared the reality of the stone chamber. Beneath that mattress is still a wooden frame set on a cold floor, surrounded by drafty walls. The furs and feathers simply make the discomfort more manageable. The contrast is striking. Luxury layered over hardship, like frosting on a loaf of stale bread. Now picture the servants bedding down nearby. They spread their straw mattresses directly on the rush-covered floor, curling into their cloaks, sharing body heat with each other or with loyal dogs. Their sleep was lighter, broken often by the need to stoke fires, fetch water, or attend to their masters. You can almost hear one servant whispering to another, making quiet jokes about who snores loudest or who smells the worst. Sleep was communal, practical, and rarely private. Imagine the soundscape of the room at night, the crackle of the hearth, the muffled snore of a guard just outside the door, the soft rustle of fur shifting as you adjust beneath it. It's warm now, warmer than anywhere else in the castle, but still imperfect. A draft sneaks through a crack in the shutters, brushing across your face like an icy hand. You pull the furs tighter, but there's always that one spot, that stubborn sliver of cold that refuses to yield. Here's another curious point. Furs weren't just functional, they were catalogued and inventoried like treasure. Medieval household accounts often listed X number of fox pelts or Y number of sable skins stored for bedding. It wasn't unusual for royals to travel with their own furs, packed carefully into chests to ensure they had reliable warmth wherever they lodged. Picture an entourage hauling crates of animal skins across muddy roads, all so the king wouldn't shiver in a guest castle. You might be tempted to romanticize the image, a queen nestled beneath ermine, the glow of firelight soft on her face, the world outside muffled by snow. And yes, there is beauty in the image, but remember the other side, the weight, the itch, the smell, the reality that even in the grandest chambers, survival depended on stacking layer after layer until your bed looked less like luxury and more like a taxidermy collection. Historians still debate the precise mix of materials. Some beds combined furs with wool blankets, feather-filled quilts, and linen sheets. Others leaned almost entirely on pelts. The layering technique itself was an art form, with servants taught how to trap air between fabrics for maximum insulation. Think of it as medieval physics applied to bedtime. Now let's add a dash of humour, because you can't help but imagine the morning ritual. The king wakes up, buried so deep in furs he can't move. He calls for attendants, who rush in and begin peeling back layers like unwrapping a very grumpy present. 1 pelt, 2 pelts, 3 pelts, until finally the monarch emerges, hair wild, eyes blinking, crown somewhere under the bed. If that isn't a humbling reminder that even rulers struggled to start their day, I don't know what is. The layering also had symbolic weight. More furs meant more wealth. To lie beneath lynx or sable was to remind everyone of your power, even in sleep. Imagine hosting foreign dignitaries and ensuring they saw your bed stacked with the rarest pelts. It wasn't just warmth, It was theatre. Even in rest, royalty performed. So here you are, tucked beneath mountains of fur, realizing the fifth secret of royal winter survival. Warmth was hoarded like treasure, layered in skins and fabrics, until sleep became both a privilege and a burden. You close your eyes, letting the weight settle on your chest, and think, maybe comfort has never been about perfection. Maybe it's always been about making do, even if making do means turning your bed into a fur-covered fortress. You're still lying beneath those heavy crimson curtains when you begin to notice something else, the sheer weight of what covers you. It isn't just one blanket or two. It's a mountain of layered furs, woven covers, and animal skins stacked so high that you feel like a sandwich trapped between oak planks and pelts. A single cloak would never be enough to keep the frost away in a stone fortress. No, surviving these winters required piles of warmth, the medieval version of central heating. Put everything you own on top of yourself and hope you can still breathe. The first sensation is heaviness. A fox pelt lies directly over your chest, its coarse hairs prickling through the linen sheet beneath. Then there's a wolfskin thrown over your legs, its head still attached as a grim reminder of what once hunted outside the walls. Above that, another thick quilt stitched with scraps of fur, and then a final bear hide that nearly pins your arms in place. If you wanted to roll over, you'd have to summon the strength of a small army. Cozy? Perhaps? Claustrophobic? Definitely. Mainstream history fact: medieval royalty and nobility prized furs not just as clothing, but as essential bedding material. Ermine, fox, sable, lynx, each had symbolic value as well as practical use. Ermine, with its soft white fur, was especially linked to purity and royal dignity. Kings and queens weren't just keeping warm, they were making statements about wealth and status even as they tried to fall asleep. And here's your quirky tidbit. Fur wasn't only prized for its warmth. It was also thought to have medicinal qualities. Some medieval texts claimed that sleeping under beaver or otter fur could improve health, ward off bad humors, or even prevent nightmares. Imagine being reassured that yes, the reason you aren't coughing as much is because you're tucked beneath half of a small zoo. Historians still argue whether royals genuinely preferred these fur-covered beds or if they tolerated them because nothing better existed. Some records describe nobles complaining about the smell of animal pelts, especially if they weren't properly cured. Others insisted that the warmth outweighed any unpleasant odours. The truth likely varied from castle to castle, from bedchamber to bedchamber. But one thing is certain, the image of royalty dozing beneath heaps of animal skins is as accurate as it is slightly absurd. Now picture yourself beneath those layers. The first few minutes are blissful. The furs hold in your body heat, and the chill of the chamber walls fades into the background. But as time passes, you realize how much weight presses down. It's the medieval version of a weighted blanket, only heavier, scratchier, and occasionally twitching with the memory of fleas. You laugh softly to yourself, realizing that kings and queens, despite their gold crowns and jeweled rings, probably woke up at least once a night just to scratch. Let's not forget the servant's role in all this. Before a monarch retired, attendants would carefully arrange the bed, layering fur upon fur, smoothing each with practiced hands. They'd warm some of the covers by the fire before draping them across the mattress, ensuring the first moments in bed felt luxurious. You can picture the scene, 2 servants holding a stretched wolf pelt near the flames, smoke curling from singed hairs, while another servant rushes forward to drape it across the royal shoulders. Comfort, yes, but comfort achieved through a small army of helpers. You picture the queen slipping into the bed beside the king, or sometimes into her own separate chamber. When together, attendants might hover nearby, quietly waiting to be dismissed, their presence both protective and intrusive. Royals lived lives of spectacle, even in their most private moments. Curtains offered a thin barrier, but the reality remained. Solitude was rare. You pull the hangings tighter and feel the sense of enclosure. For once, the world is kept at bay, and the idea of true sleep seems possible. Let's not romanticize it too much, though. Picture waking in the middle of the night. The fire has died low, your breath curls like smoke above your face, and despite the curtains, the draught still pries its way in. You shift beneath layers of fur, trying to find warmth, and the creak of the bed echoes in the silence. Somewhere nearby a servant stirs, listening for your call. Comfort is never absolute here. It's a constant battle, and the bed is only one weapon in the fight. Now consider how the bed looked in daylight. Sunlight, pale and weak through narrow shutters, would fall across its crimson folds, turning the hangings into a glowing wall of ruby. The bed became the centerpiece of the chamber, not tucked into a corner, but often raised on a platform, as though to remind everyone who entered that this was the seat of power, even in sleep. To step near it without permission could mean punishment. To sit on it, unthinkable unless you were royal blood. But here's another quirky note. Travellers and honoured guests might occasionally be invited to share the royal bed, not in the scandalous way you might imagine, but as a mark of trust and intimacy. In medieval culture, sharing a bed was often about politics, not passion. Imagine lying awake beside a monarch, listening to him snore while trying to remember your lines for tomorrow's negotiations. Awkward, paha. P.S. But a sign you were in the king's confidence. Historians still argue about how common this practice was. Was it widespread ritual or rare exception? Did kings genuinely share their beds with courtiers for warmth, or was it more symbolic? The sources disagree, leaving us with tantalizing glimpses but no definitive answer. As you lie beneath the canopy, eyes heavy, you notice the muffled world around you. The wind that rattled shutters now sounds distant. The footsteps in the corridor fade to whispers. The fabric absorbs sound as much as it traps heat, and for the first time tonight you feel the possibility of peace. Perhaps this is why canopy beds became such icons. They were small worlds, tiny fortresses within fortresses, offering the illusion that the cold, noisy, draught-filled castle could be shut out with a tug of curtains. Your mind drifts and you realize how symbolic it all is. The king's authority is like this bed, grand, intimidating, and yet fragile when stripped of its curtains. Without the trappings, it's just a wooden frame and fabric, much like power without ritual is just one man standing in the cold. And so, as you curl deeper into the imagined furs, you uncover the fourth secret of royal winter survival. Sleep was never simply sleep. It was ceremony. It was symbolism, and it was a nightly battle against draughts that kings and queens fought from behind walls of velvet and gold. The bed was their throne of the night, their shield against the cold, their reminder that even power must rest eventually. The glow of the great hall fades behind you as you move deeper into the royal quarters, where the true symbol of privilege awaits, the bed itself. Now don't picture your own mattress. Springy, cushioned, maybe with a memory foam topper. No, what you find before you is a towering canopy bed of carved oak, darkened with age and polished to a sheen by generations of careful hands. Its posts rise like the trunks of trees, sturdy and immovable, supporting a roof of fabric that drapes down in thick folds. This isn't merely a place to lie down, it's a fortress within the fortress, a shelter wrapped in cloth and symbolism. As you step closer, the scale of it is striking. Beds like these could be large enough to fit not just a king or queen, but attendants if needed. After all, in a world where warmth was a precious commodity, sharing body heat wasn't just practical, it was sometimes essential. Curtains of crimson velvet hang on all sides, embroidered with golden thread depicting vines, saints, or family crests. When drawn, these curtains transformed the bed into a cocoon, trapping whatever warmth the body and bedclothes produced, offering at least the illusion of comfort against the castle's relentless chill. Mainstream history fact: canopy beds weren't merely decorative, they were designed with insulation in mind. Those heavy curtains created microclimates in otherwise drafty chambers. Close the hangings, and suddenly you weren't in a stone box anymore. You were in a fabric cave, a little warmer, a little safer, and a lot more private. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some of these beds were equipped with intricate mechanisms to open and close the hangings. Pull a cord and the curtains would sweep shut or part dramatically, like stage drapery. Imagine the drama of a king tugging a rope and watching his bed vanish into a fortress of fabric. It's equal parts practical and theatrics. Cal. Historians still argue whether these beds genuinely offered comfort or simply the suggestion of it. Sure, they trapped heat, but they also trapped smoke from braziers, body odours, and the occasional flea. Were they cosy refuges or claustrophobic traps? The debate continues, though perhaps the truth is that they were both at once, a place of respite in a world where perfection was impossible. You reach out and draw one curtain aside. Inside, the mattress looks surprisingly inviting, stuffed with feathers rather than straw, the linens crisp and clean. Several furs are layered on top, their earthy scent mingling with beeswax and smoke from the nearby hearth. You sit on the edge, the bed creaking under your weight, and imagine the king settling here after a long day of ruling, or perhaps scheming. He'd have attendants help remove layers of robes, crown, and jewellery before finally sinking into this insulated nest. But the bed wasn't just for sleep. It was a stage for power. The morning levee, the ceremonial rising of the monarch, often took place here. Courtiers would file in, bowing low as the curtains were drawn back to reveal the ruler in all his half-awake glory. Imagine being forced to look regal while yawning and scratching at your woolen nightgown. If you think your Zoom meetings start too early, consider the medieval king, whose first audience happened before he'd even had breakfast. Yet at night, with curtains closed and guards stationed outside, the bed was something else entirely, a sanctuary. You lie back and let your eyes trace the patterns embroidered overhead. Scenes of saints perhaps, or golden suns stitched to remind the sleeper that daylight and with it warmth would eventually return. The canopy wasn't just about insulation, it was psychological comfort. It was the suggestion that even in the darkest winter, you were wrapped in symbols of protectors. Ion. You notice one figure now, a child curled beneath a bench, wrapped in a teal wool cloak that looks several sizes too large. His small face glows in the firelight, and beside him, a loyal dog curls tighter, both creatures united by instinct for warmth. Scenes like this blurred the rigid lines of hierarchy. In the half-sleep of a cold night, noble and servant alike drew closer to the hearth, and for once titles mattered less than proximity to fire. The hall itself adds layers of meaning. Look up, and you see carved beams forming a forest of wood above you, often painted or gilded in richer castles. Shields might hang along the walls, a reminder that this space wasn't only for feasts but also for defense. If enemies breached the gates, the great hall could transform into a last stand. That duality, celebration by day, survival by night, runs through every detail of the castle. Your attention drifts to the far side, where a minstrel slumps with his lute across his lap, half asleep. His last notes still seem to vibrate in the air. The sound mixes with the fire's crackle, the snore of nobles, the faint drip of melted snow outside the shuttered windows. It's a lullaby, built not of intention, but of exhaustion, a reminder that medieval life rarely paused, only slowed briefly when firelight forced it to. Another quirky note. Rushes on the floor weren't just for cushioning footsteps. They were strewn with herbs like lavender or rosemary meant to sweeten the air and ward off pests. As you walk, the rushes crunch softly, releasing faint scents into the smoky room. It's a primitive form of air freshener, though you doubt it did much against the overpowering smell of sweat, smoke, and spilled ale. Still, the attempt at comfort feels strangely modern, as though even centuries ago people longed for their surroundings to smell just a little better. Historians still debate whether the Great Hall was more comfortable than private chambers in winter. On one hand, the massive fireplace kept the room warmer than most other spaces. On the other, the hall's sheer size meant much of that heat disappeared into the rafters, leaving the edges chilly. Did people huddle close to the fire because it was cozy, or because the rest of the room was an icebox? Like so many details of medieval life, the truth probably varies by castle, by season, and by the tolerance of the people involved. You imagine yourself dozing here. The stone floor might be unforgiving, the benches narrow, but the glow of the fire soothes your senses. Your eyelids grow heavy as warmth seeps into your cheeks, your ears filled with the rhythm of crackling logs. For a moment you forget the bitter corridors, the guarded chambers, the layers of wool. For a moment the great hall convinces you that winter can be tamed. And then, of course, someone snores louder than a trumpet, jerking you back to reality. You grin despite yourself. Medieval life was full of these small absurdities, grand architecture paired with very human flaws, solemn rituals paired with spilled wine and crooked snores. The great hall held them all together, proof that even kings and queens couldn't escape the messiness of being human. So here, in the firelit glow of the hall, you uncover the third secret of royal winter survival. Sometimes the best bed was no bed at all, just a warm hearth, a heavy cloak, and the courage to laugh at your own shivering. You notice one figure now, a child curled beneath a bench, wrapped in a teal wool cloak that looks several sizes too large. His small face glows in the firelight, and beside him, a loyal dog curls tighter, both creatures united by instinct for warmth. Scenes like this blurred the rigid lines of hierarchy. In the half-sleep of a cold night, noble and servant alike drew closer to the hearth, and for once titles mattered less than proximity to fire. The hall itself adds layers of meaning. Look up, and you see carved beams forming a forest of wood above you, often painted or gilded in richer castles. Shields might hang along the walls, a reminder that this space wasn't only for feasts but also for defense. If enemies breached the gates, the great hall could transform into a last stand. That duality, celebration by day, survival by night, runs through every detail of the castle. Your attention drifts to the far side, where a minstrel slumps with his lute across his lap, half asleep. His last notes still seem to vibrate in the air. The sound mixes with the fire's crackle, the snore of nobles, the faint drip of melted snow outside the shuttered windows. It's a lullaby, built not of intention, but of exhaustion, a reminder that medieval life rarely paused, only slowed briefly when firelight forced it to. Another quirky note. Rushes on the floor weren't just for cushioning footsteps. They were strewn with herbs like lavender or rosemary meant to sweeten the air and ward off pests. As you walk, the rushes crunch softly, releasing faint scents into the smoky room. It's a primitive form of air freshener, though you doubt it did much against the overpowering smell of sweat, smoke, and spilled ale. Still, the attempt at comfort feels strangely modern, as though even centuries ago people longed for their surroundings to smell just a little better. Historians still debate whether the Great Hall was more comfortable than private chambers in winter. On one hand, the massive fireplace kept the room warmer than most other spaces. On the other, the hall's sheer size meant much of that heat disappeared into the rafters, leaving the edges chilly. Did people huddle close to the fire because it was cozy, or because the rest of the room was an icebox. Like so many details of medieval life, the truth probably varies by castle, by season, and by the tolerance of the people involved. You imagine yourself dozing here. The stone floor might be unforgiving, the benches narrow, but the glow of the fire soothes your senses. Your eyelids grow heavy as warmth seeps into your cheeks, your ears filled with the rhythm of crackling logs. For a moment you forget the bitter corridors, the guarded chambers, the layers of wool. For a moment the great hall convinces you that winter can be tamed. And then, of course, someone snores louder than a trumpet, jerking you back to reality. You grin despite yourself. Medieval life was full of these small absurdities, grand architecture paired with very human flaws, solemn rituals paired with spilled wine and crooked snores. The great hall held them all together, proof that even kings and queens couldn't escape the messiness of being human. So here, in the firelit glow of the hall, you uncover the third secret of royal winter survival. Sometimes the best bed was no bed at all, just a warm hearth, a heavy cloak, and the courage to laugh at your own shivering. And so, in these inner chambers, you discover the second secret of royal winter survival. Warmth was always partial, always fleeting, but it was fiercely guarded, like treasure, like life itself. Step beyond the guards, close the door, and for a brief, fragile moment you could almost believe you were safe from the cold. You wander further, past the chamber door and down another passage until the air suddenly grows warmer and brighter. Ahead lies the heart of the castle's life, the great hall. During the day it's a cacophony of sound, laughter, shouting, clattering dishes. But at night, in the lull after feasting, it glows with a gentler energy. The fire at the far end roars in the hearth, stretching tall enough to lick the carved stone mantel, throwing golden light across wooden beams that vanish into shadow above. The room is cavernous, a space designed to impress, to intimidate, to remind everyone inside that power here is not only visible, but palpable. You step onto the rush-covered floor, noticing discarded cups and trenchers scattered near benches. The feast has ended, but the embers of merriment still linger. A few nobles slump against the tables, heads drooping onto folded arms. One snores loudly, his saffron cloak sliding into a puddle of spilled wine. Another noble, wrapped in a russet mantle, leans back in his chair, eyes closed, mouth open, clearly choosing firelight over the trek back to a cold chamber. You can't blame them. With the flames painting the hall in shades of orange and gold, this was one of the warmest spaces in the entire castle. Mainstream history fact, the Great Hall wasn't just for eating, it was the central hub of medieval life. By day it served as courtroom, council chamber, and gathering place. By night it became a makeshift dormitory for lesser guests, retainers, or even unlucky nobles who preferred warmth over status. Sleeping it. And the hall might not sound glamorous, but at least you wouldn't wake up with icicles forming on your bed curtains. And here's your quirky tidbit. It was common for some royals themselves to occasionally doze by the hearth, especially if the cold in their chambers became unbearable. Imagine the spectacle. A king stretched out on a bench, wrapped in a fur-lined cloak, snoring as loudly as his peasants might. The symbolism of the hall didn't vanish just because someone nodded off. If anything, it reminded everyone that even kings wanted warmth more than ceremony sometimes. Still, historians argue whether this was practical necessity or just storytelling exaggeration. Did monarchs actually abandon their chambers to sleep near the hall's fire, or is it one of those anecdotes polished by centuries of retelling? Some records mention it, others are silent, leaving us to wonder whether royal pride outweighed frozen toes. You step closer to the hearth, feeling the wave of heat hit your cheeks. Sparks jump, wood pops, and a servant pokes at the logs with iron tongs, stoking life into the flames. Around you, shadows dance along the tapestries, stretching the faces of knights and saints into flickering ghosts. The smell is thick, Roasted meat from earlier, the tang of smoke, the faint sweetness of spilled ale drying into the rushes. Your senses are swaddled, and you understand why so many lingered here. The hall wasn't just warm, it was alive. Picture the scene a few hours earlier. Tables groaning under roasted boar, trenchers piled with bread, cups of spiced wine passed hand to hand. Laughter echoing up to the rafters. A jester juggling apples by the fire, nearly dropping one into the flames. A harpist plucking gentle notes from the corner. The great hall was spectacle and sustenance, body and soul fed at once, and afterward, when bellies were heavy and limbs too sluggish to carry 3 people away, the hall became a dormitory by default. You settle into the chamber and notice the bed, large, raised on a wooden frame, draped with heavy hangings. It dominates the room, a clear statement of hierarchy. This is not just where you sleep, this is where power reclines. A monarch's bed was both a piece of furniture and a stage. Political rituals took place here, including the morning levee, where attendants and courtiers crowded in to watch the ruler awaken. Imagine opening your eyes every morning to find an audience waiting to bow and flatter. Sleep wasn't entirely private, even here. Yet at night, when the door bolted and the guards stood just beyond, the chamber was as close as a king or queen got to solitude. You sit at the edge of the bed, listening to the faint hum of the castle beyond the walls, the clank of a bucket, the murmur of a guard, the sigh of winter wind, and realize how rare silence was in a medieval world. No traffic, no machinery, no buzzing lights, just stone, fire, and your own heartbeat. The room tells you more if you look closely. There's a carved chest at the foot of the bed holding linens or maybe jewellery. A candlestick flickers beside it, the flame fighting against shadows that pool like ink in the corners. A small devotional shrine occupies one wall, where the Queen kneels briefly, whispering prayers. Faith wasn't just about piety, it was about survival. When your world was full of drafts, disease, and enemies, a whispered prayer before bed was the medieval version of double-checking the lock and setting the thermostat. You notice how the Queen removes her mantle and lays it across the chest. The indigo fabric glows faintly, lined with white fur from ermine or fox. Royals weren't shy about layering. Beneath the mantle she still wears a gown of saffron wool, a chemise beneath that, and maybe even extra stockings. Each layer is a shield against the cold, but also against the idea vulnerability. To be seen shivering was to be seen human, and royalty, at least in theory, was supposed to embody something above the human condition. But you can imagine the private jokes. Maybe the Queen whispered to her ladies-in-waiting, "If I freeze, tell them I died nobly." Humour, after all, is another layer of insulation, and it's not hard to picture the servants giggling quietly as they tried to keep their own teeth from chattering. Royals might have had more furs, but everyone inside those walls felt the same winter bite. You lean closer to the fireplace. It's small, barely adequate for the space, and the flames lick at half-burned logs. Sparks pop, smoke snakes up the chimney, and the smell is sharp, almost sweet. You realize how much of a luxury this was. Peasants outside the castle often had one smoky hearth in the centre of a hut, filling the entire space with haze. Here, the chimney carried smoke upward, leaving the chamber breathable, if still chilly. It was progress, medieval style. The debate continues among scholars. Did monarchs genuinely sleep through the night in these guarded chambers? Or did they toss and turn, waking often to stoke the fire or call for more blankets? Diaries suggest both. Some kings complained of sleepless nights, while others bragged about their ability to rest even during wartime. Either way, the chamber tells its story not just in walls and furniture, but in the silence it preserves, the sense of lives paused, of bodies trying to rest in defiance of the cold. As you sit there longer, your imagination drifts. You picture the guards outside shifting on their feet, stamping to keep blood flowing. You hear the shuffle of a servant bringing in hot coals through a side passage. You smell the faint sweetness of beeswax candles. The chamber is alive, even in its quiet. And in that aliveness, you glimpse the reality of royal life, a privilege wrapped in stone, guarded by steel, haunted by drafts. You slip past the guards, stepping into a space that feels like a fortress within the fortress. The inner chambers are guarded not just by stone walls, but by layers of protocol, ritual, and, of course, two very tired-looking men in armor who would rather be anywhere else. Their halberds gleam faintly in the torchlight, and their cloaks, russet wool thick with frost, hang stiffly around their shoulders. You imagine them whispering complaints under their breath, but they straighten the moment you pass, because letting the cold in is bad enough. Letting danger in would be unthinkable. The door creaks open, oak so heavy it takes both arms to pull it. Inside, the atmosphere changes, slightly. You're not exactly stepping into a modern heated suite, but compared to the corridor, it's as though you've walked into the eye of the storm. The chamber is warmer by a few blessed degrees, thanks to braziers burning low in the corners and a fireplace that's doing its best against a wall of stone that insists on staying icy. You pause to take it in. The space is large but feels more intimate than the echoing hallways. Tapestries hang from the walls, their woven stories of saints and kings doubling as insulation. They ripple gently whenever a draught sneaks in, like sails on a ship refusing to surrender. A queen in indigo robes steps lightly across the floor, her footsteps muffled by rushes scattered beneath her. She carries herself with practiced calm, though you can't help but notice her holding her fur-lined mantle tighter around her shoulders. Royals knew how to act composed, but they weren't immune to frostbite. The chamber is a world of contrasts, flickering light against shadow, gold embroidery against rough stone, warmth against persistent cold. You can almost hear the crackle of the fire blending with the steady drip of melting snow from the ceiling joints. And then, beyond those, sensory details, the silence, thick, heavy, the kind that presses into your ears. Unlike the bustling great hall, the inner chambers were sanctuaries of quiet, which made them perfect for sleep, for prayer, or for plotting, depending on the mood of the monarch. Mainstream history. Fact, these private chambers, often called solar rooms in English castles, were designed precisely to offer refuge from the drafts of the main hall. They were the medieval equivalent of a bedroom suite, smaller, easier to heat, and easier to guard. They represented the idea of privacy at a time when most of life was lived in public. But here's the quirky tidbit. Many of these chambers had their own small hidden passages, often for servants. Imagine a trap door or a secret staircase behind a tapestry. This allowed attendants to slip in quietly at night with fresh coals, food, or, if gossip was true, personal company. You might be tucked beneath a fur blanket, half asleep, when suddenly the wall shifts and a servant emerges carrying an iron pot. It sounds spooky, but it was just practical design. In a way, it made the room both safer and more unsettling. Historians still argue whether these chambers offered true comfort. Some believe they were marvels of cozy medieval engineering, warm enough for nobles to sleep soundly. Others argue they were just slightly less miserable spaces where wealth could only do so much against nature. And given the records of kings complaining about frost and queens layering 3 gowns just to sit still, the latter seems more believable. Now imagine being a royal child, sent out of your chamber to visit your parents, or to sneak some mulled wine from the kitchens. The corridor must have seemed like an endless, dark trial of courage. Every echo doubled, every shadow stretched. That same sense of dread is probably why so many legends of castle ghosts began in the hallways. Cold draughts became phantom fingers, and unexplained noises became the restless dead. A simple fact, many castles still have local tales of ghostly queens or knights pacing the corridors, eternally searching for warmth that never came. The irony is that kings and queens themselves often disliked moving through these spaces at night. Instead, they had servants do the shivering for them. Need to fetch something from another chamber? That's what attendants were for. The monarch stayed tucked behind hangings, while someone else braved the freezing arteries of the keep. In this sense, being royal wasn't just about privilege, it was survival. You edge forward, your footsteps echoing louder now. The corridor seems to narrow, and you notice torches bracketed at uneven intervals. Flames spit against iron holders, barely pushing back the dark. And as you pass each one, you sense how temporary that warmth really is. Within steps, the cold is back, crawling under your cloak and settling at the base of your spine. Here's a thought experiment. If you could go back and stand beside a 14th century king on his nightly walk through these corridors, you'd probably bond instantly over one thing: the shared hatred of winter drafts. He might have more rings on his fingers and a bigger entourage, but both of you would be fighting the exact same enemy, a castle that wanted you frozen. Now let's bring in a quirky tidbit. Some castles in France experimented with glazed windows as early as the 14th century. Imagine that, actual glass, however crude, instead of open slits. It was expensive and rare, but for those who could afford it, the corridors might have been marginally less brutal. Still, marginally less brutal isn't quite comfort. You'd still see frost creep across the panes and condensation dripping down to soak the stone below. The debate that still lingers among scholars is whether royals acclimated to this environment or constantly sought ways to escape it. Did they simply grow tougher, hardened by drafty walls? Or did they endlessly complain, surrounding themselves with layers of servants and luxuries just to make survival possible? Some records suggest kings carried personal braziers, or even had servants walk ahead of them holding warmed stones wrapped in cloth. Whether that's exaggeration or truth, we'll never really know. As you push deeper into the heart of the castle, you can almost hear the past layering itself on the present. Boots of guards, whispers of attendants, and maybe, faintly, the laughter of a jester echoing from a distant hall. The corridor doesn't just connect spaces, it connects centuries of shivering royals, servants, and curious wanderers like you. And so, with every step, you learn the first royal secret of winter life in a castle. The corridors were a punishment disguised as architecture, a gauntlet of stone and shadow that reminded you power doesn't always buy comfort. You've just begun, and already the cold is nipping your bones. Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into the icy bones of a medieval castle, and right away you can feel it. The stones are sweating cold, the torches flicker with a nervous kind of glow, and your breath hovers in front of your face like a tiny ghost that just refuses to leave. You shuffle forward, boots echoing in endless corridors, and already your toes are questioning every life decision that led you here. The truth is, most of us, me, you, and just about anyone with sense, would not last 1 week in a stone fortress in the heart of January. You probably wouldn't survive this no matter how many wool socks you own. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and local time in the comments because I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first step through the castle is always the same, that breath-stealing rush of cold air that seeps through the cracks. You feel it in your teeth, the kind of draft that makes you wonder how anyone could have slept here at all. Castles weren't designed for comfort. They were designed to survive sieges, to intimidate neighbours, and to show off wealth in a big, stone, look-at-me way. Heating was an afterthought. If you've ever lived in a badly insulated apartment, multiply that chill by 10, add a few drafty arrow slits, and subtract your modern heating system. Congratulations, you're now royal and you're miserable. You tread carefully, your palm brushing the damp wall. These corridors were like arteries carrying servants, guards, and nobles through the heart of the fortress. The stones are enormous, stacked with precision, but they hold cold like a miser clutches coins. At night, the fires are low. They radiate that cold back into every surface. So even if you press your hand to the wall hoping for warmth from a passing torch, all you get is the damp sting of winter itself. Now picture the guards who had to stand watch here. They wore thick wool cloaks, heavy boots, and carried halberds or spears. Even so, their teeth probably rattled louder than the weapons at times. A quirky fact, some castles experimented with floor rushes, straw, herbs, even petals scattered across the ground. This wasn't just to cover smells. The thicker layers could insulate slightly against the chill. Imagine walking on what amounts to a medieval carpet, though one that crunched under your feet and sometimes concealed the odd rat. And still, historians argue whether the corridors were ever intended for more than brief, brisk walks. You didn't linger here unless you had to. There were no cosy benches under torchlight, no alcoves with padded cushions, just long, echoing stone. When you walked them at night, you were usually on your way to somewhere warmer, or at least less unbearable. Your breath fogs the air as you step further, and now you catch the faint light of a brazier tucked in a corner. Servants sometimes set these up along hallways, small fires in portable iron bowls filled with glowing coals. They offered patches of relief, though they also produced smoke that clung to your clothes. Think of them as medieval space heaters, except instead of a gentle electric hum, you had crackling embers and the occasional spark jumping out to threaten your robe. The sensory overload is real. The smell of smoke, the scratch of wool against your neck, the sound of dripping water from somewhere high in the vaulted ceiling, and every so often the flutter of a bat that had decided to share the rafters. You pause, tilt your head back, and watch it wheel silently against the bliss. Acnus above. In daylight, the corridors might have been alive with bustling servants carrying wicker baskets or lugging water buckets. But at night, it was eerie emptiness, punctuated by shadows.